Good evening all and welcome to tonight's Scary Stories in the Rain. Don't forget to subscribe for new stories every week and check out our app with over 5,000 scary stories and no ads. And finally, a huge thank you for being here. It means the world to me. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened years ago when I was 19. I'm now in my mid-20s. And I still remember this very clearly because of how creeped out I was. Back then, I was living over 600 miles away from my parents, in a different state. Even though there was a distance, my mum and I still spoke on the phone at least twice a week, and we were still very close. So when we found out her cancer was back, I didn't think twice about dropping everything to drive down to see her. A plane ticket would be too expensive. I had a 10-year-old Toyota that might have been a bit beat up, but still got me from A to B quite cheaply and quietly. My parents weren't thrilled of the idea of me driving the 11 hours by myself, but my mind was made up. So they offered me a deal. I would stop at a rest stop every 2 to 3 hours and stretch my legs and call them. In exchange for this courtesy, they would pay for my gas. If I didn't call within the 3-hour window, they would assume I'd been in an accident and call me repeatedly, interrupting the audiobook/podcast they knew I would have on. I accepted the deal, and that's why I was at this particular rest stop at 2:45 a.m. This was actually one of the nicest stops. Well lit, multiple vending machines that didn't have huge cages around them, and the payphone wasn't broken, and it looked clean. There were a couple of cars with people sleeping in them. I still had 15 minutes before I had to check in with my parents, so I got out the car and stretched, and then almost jumped out my skin when I heard a man's voice right behind me.
"Miss, can I ask you a favor?"
I turned around. He's leaning against my car. I have no idea how he got there so fast. I didn't see him when I parked, but there he was, uncomfortably close to me. He looked to be in his 40s. He didn't look dirty or twitchy. He was too close, but his body language didn't scream threatening. And even though I was 19 years old, barely over 5 feet, and at that point in my life 110 pounds soaking wet, and even though I had already binged a lot of true crime media, and knew the dangers of a girl my age alone at night, with an out-of-state license plate, my dumb ass asked what he needed. He told me he accidentally locked his keys and phone in his truck, and could he just borrow my phone real quick to call his friend? It would just take a second, and it would really help him out. And I almost handed him my phone. I was reaching into my pocket to give it to him, with a "no problem," when I looked at his face. Like I said, the rest stop was surprisingly well lit, and the guy appeared to be normal in every respect, except for his eyes. He had dead shark eyes. You know what I'm talking about. It's the Ted Bundy, Dick Cheney actress in a Glade commercial who is trying to convince us that she's in love with a dumbass who doesn't know how air freshener works. Eyes. They're smiling, but the eyes are vacant and creepy and staring way too hard. I got that feeling that says run away. I knew immediately not to hand this guy my phone. So I put on my best customer service smile and told him, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, but I don't have a charger, and I need to save my battery for the tracking app that my parents have on my phone, and I need that juice to call my parents, which is actually right now. Good luck." I turned and walked about 20 feet away. He didn't leave. He was just leaning against my car watching me. And now I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave him alone with my car because he creeped me out. He had that serial killer face. So going to the bathroom is out. But I also wanted to get away from him, prove that I'm not gonna help, and maybe he'll leave. I could technically get to my car, but I would have to get very close to him, unless I crawled over my passenger side door. He wasn't moving. So I did the first thing that popped into my mind. I called my dad, and my dad for the first time that night, didn't pick up the phone. When I heard his voicemail, I glanced back. The guy still hadn't moved. He was still staring at me, so I faked a conversation with my dad. I angled my body so that the guy couldn't see that I'd hung up the phone and loudly said that I should be home in about half hour, when in reality, it was at least another 4-hour drive. I mentioned exactly where I was and reassured the fake caller that this was a good rest stop with plenty of lighting and a couple of visible security cameras. The guy still hadn't moved, and I'm running out of steam on this fake conversation. In the years since, I've thought of a lot of things I could have said while pretending to talk to my dad, but in that moment I was beginning to seriously freak out and my mind went blank. So I hung up and didn't know what to do. I had hoped the fake phone call would scare him off, but he was persistent, still leaning against my car. I stalled for more minutes. I bought cookies from the vending machine. I walked around a little, and at this point, he'd been leaning against my car staring at me for 10 minutes. I honestly debated walking up to one of the men sleeping in their cars and asking for help. And just the thought of having to wake someone up to help me get into my own goddamn car annoyed me enough that I stopped stalling and headed back to my vehicle. I decided that unless he touched me, I was just going to pretend he wasn't there. He waited until I was unlocking my car door before he started talking to me again. He told me that he really needs to use my phone. He's stranded here unless he can call a friend to bring the spare keys. He's not angry or begging. His voice sounds weirdly friendly, but he's been creepily watching me for way too long while blocking my exit, so I'm not falling for it. I almost pointed out the working payphone, just in case I'm wrong about this, and was being a bitch to a guy who needed help. But then he leaned forward, and as I was getting in, I lost all nerve and slammed and locked the door as fast as possible. He didn't move until I started the car and put it in reverse, and then he finally stepped back and let me pull out. I didn't even have my seatbelt on, and I was so focused on staying away from him. And then halfway out the rest stop, my mum called me. My mum, who would freak out if I didn't pick up, and who was already sick, and I needed to put on my seatbelt. I could still see him in my mirror. He was standing right next to where I was parked with his back to me. He was far enough away that I felt okay parking to answer the phone, but I kept my engine running and a watch on him. I didn't want to worry my mum, so I told her everything was fine, where I was, my ETA. And now that I was in my locked car away from him, I was beginning to feel like I had overreacted. She scolds me about speeding, and I tune her out because the guy is moving now. As my mum lectures me about road safety, I watch the guy cross into a truck, unlock the door, and get in. The keys being locked in no longer seemed to be an issue for him. I watched the truck head back out to the freeway and drive out of sight. I had to pretend to be fine and not upset to my mum. I didn't get back on the road for another 20 minutes, and when I did, I didn't speed. I didn't want to see that truck again. I found out years later that the closest city to the rest stop had major problems with sex trafficking, and the girls who look like they don't live nearby or look like maybe they're living out of their cars tend to be targets. I don't know if that was what was happening, or if he was just trying to scare me to hand over my phone. Either way, creep at the rest stop. Let's not meet again. This all happened when I was 19. I'm not the best looking dude, so I've never had much luck with women, and I ended up on Tinder. I wasn't having much luck there either until the 3rd month of using it, when a blonde woman named Katie messaged me. She was pretty enough that I dismissed her as a bot. It wasn't until 3 days later that she messaged me again, which was odd because most bots never message more than once. I clicked her chat and replied, then looked at her profile. What I saw was pretty generic, but definitely not a bot's profile. We'd been speaking for about a month when she proposed the idea that I come and see her. I was pretty reluctant, as she lived nearly 8 hours away by car. But I had to admit, I really did like her quite a bit, and I had been thinking about asking her if I could come see her for a while now. After a bit more badgering from her, I finally said I would take the drive. At this point, I had no reason to doubt who she said she was. We had video chatted every other week and called most days. I assumed I got really lucky. Things did get a little weird on their way though. She kept messaging me asking me where I was to make sure I was still coming. At some point, when I took more than 30 minutes to respond, she sent me a slew of annoying texts. Admittedly, I had chalked this up to her being nervous about me coming to see her. I was pretty nervous about it too, and couldn't blame her. I had a hard time finding her house at first. The directions she gave me were pretty confusing, and it was back through a series of gravel and dirt roads and a large thicket of trees. It was still about midday when I came onto an old-looking house. A window on the second floor was boarded up, and it didn't look abandoned, just worse for wear. Katie's red buggy that she liked to talk about was parked in front of the garage. I looked at my phone and texted her that I was here. She only sent a smiley face in return. When I got out of my car to go knock at the door, I noticed someone was looking at me from the second floor windows. It was creepy, but I figured it was her father or someone. She had told me he comes to stay with her every now and then, so I ignored it and knocked on her door. She answered with a smile and even gave me a kiss, which surprised me, and I followed her inside. We sat down on her couch and started talking about our plans when I asked her about her dad. "You didn't tell me your dad was here," I said. "Was that going to be a surprise or—" Katie looked confused and told me that her dad wasn't here. I still thought she was keeping up the act, and I told her that she didn't have to keep pretending, and that I had seen him looking at me through the upstairs window. Katie went pale and said we had to get out of there now. We both ran to our cars, and when I questioned Katie, she informed me that her dad wasn't there and that she had been home until I showed up. I called the police, and while I was on the phone giving the address, Katie gasped and pointed to the window where I had seen the guy last. He was looking at us from the window again. I get a better look at him, and he seemed older and frail, almost like he hadn't eaten anything in a while. He left the window after he noticed we had spotted him. The police took a half hour to show up, and the whole time Katie was crying and mumbling about how she was an idiot for not keeping her doors locked. When the police finally did show up, one started asking me and Katie questions, and the other two searched the house. They came back out a little later and told me and Katie that while they didn't find anyone, they did find that the back door was hanging open. Whoever it was had run out into the woods, but the cops were sure the house was empty. After the cops left, Katie asked me to stay the night because she was too scared to be in her house alone. I gladly did, and slept downstairs on the couch, as Katie's bed was the room next to the one the man had been in. Katie had also bought out the shotgun her father had given her but never used. I told her it was fine, the man was gone, but she insisted she'd feel safer if we had it out. I'm glad she did. Later that night, I was still wide awake watching TV. Katie had somehow managed to fall asleep, and from the kitchen, I heard the sound of the doorknob being turned. At this point, I wasn't even scared, I was just pissed. I flipped on the light in the kitchen and pointed the gun at the kitchen door, and there he was. The guy that had been in the house before was standing on the other side of the glass door. He looked shocked, and I'm glad we had locked the door. The man unfroze and yet again ran into the woods. I woke up Katie and told her what happened and called the police yet again. When they arrived, they did a sweep of the woods and found no one, and they told Katie and me that it would probably be a good idea to stay somewhere else for the night. Me and Katie said our goodbyes. She was going to go stay at her friend's house and I was going home. I left a little after she did, and I was on the phone with my brother telling him about what happened. My headlights were on, and as I was talking, something caught my eye. The man was standing at the corner of the house just watching me. I gunned it out of there and didn't even bother calling the cops again, but I did text Katie, and she was going to call them. I don't think Katie even went back to the house alone after that. It was late spring in my 7th year of school. It was a rough school in a sketchy area. I was in the 3rd year of my middle school, crafting a magnet program to better integrate the classes, and the enrollment for the program was small. Even smaller numbers for female, so making female friends in an isolated environment as this was difficult at best. That's when I met Sabrina. She was non-magnet and wanted to have me and her friend Kylie spend the night, so I was thrilled. She lived in an apartment with her mother and brother that was across from a racetrack and a bar, super sketchy area. Her mother sold handmade keychains at the flea market each weekend. This is important later. Things get weird about the time we get pizza and movies. Her mother was a little odd and hung out the whole time. Like, she was a 13-year-old girl and regularly going into her room and calling Sabrina. We couldn't ask what was up because her mum was always there, and this was the age of pages. So around 9 p.m. she goes to bed. To our dismay, 10 minutes later, she's calling Sabrina to come to bed too. She was actually going to stay with her mum at her own sleepover, so left with a few pillows that had seen better days and no blankets, Kylie and I were going to have a sleepover to ourselves. We start the movie back up, and suddenly Sabrina comes out to get the phone. As she is about to go back into the room, she whispers, "Don't stay up late. We have to go to work at the flea market tomorrow and leave at 5:30. I guess she saw our faces and she giggles this creepy giggle and adds, "Didn't think the pizza was for free, did you?" Then she goes into the room and locks the door. Kylie, who I had just met this evening, and I exchange glances. This was the first we heard about this. We were never even asked. After a short conversation, we decided we wanted to go home. Our parents were more likely to be awake now than they would at 5:30 in the morning, so we knock on the bedroom door, to no answer. We try and try, but nothing. There's no way they're asleep that fast. So I go to the kitchen to see if there's another phone. Nope. They locked us in the living room of this one-bedroom apartment with no phone and no restroom, and now they weren't responding at all. This is where the young and dumb formulate a plan. We know school isn't very far away, and Kylie says she lives near school, so we decide to find a payphone or walk to her house. How bad could it be? Biggest mistake of our lives. We try knocking one last time to the same result, so we gather our belongings and leave. How the world outside changed after 10 p.m. The bar a stone's throw away from the apartment was jumping. We go up to the payphone that's near the street and close to the rear of the bar. It's broken. As I put down the receiver, some burly, drunk man rounds the corner towards us. We were two 13-year-olds that could have passed for 17 easily. Neither of us were dressed showing much skin, but Mr. Drunk Dude liked what he saw. First he yelled if we wanted a party, or if he could buy us drinks. "No thanks," we replied, and started to walk in the direction of her home. This only infuriated him, as he's now yelling that we're skanks, and nobody turns their back on him. We keep on. He starts to stumble after us, and catches Kylie by the wrist. She's trying to shake him off to no avail, and he's telling us what he's going to do to us. We're getting terrified because she can't break the hold and he won't let go. That's when Kylie lands a shot into his crown jewels. We take off running, but the shot must have sobered him up, and he's angrier in pursuit. We scan the area. There's no place to hide, no place to get help, and we're now not trusting if we saw anyone that would help us. We run loops around the apartment Sabrina lived in, but somehow one of Mr. Drunk's friends had joined in. We knew they were behind us, and that they are alienating, tailing us, and yelling to his friends, saying that there's one for each of us. So, to not let us get away. Now we know we're trapped, so we book it up some random metal stairs. We hit the second floor, are banging doors, but nobody is opening them. Luckily, we find an open door at the end, and we think we're in the clear. But then we hear constant clanking and one of them is coming up, but the stairs have no second floor visibility. We dash into the room only to see it's a laundry room, with no door to lock. We start wedging ourselves behind the machines, praying and hoping we're not found, because he's now on the second floor and heading our way. It goes quiet, except music and voices from the bar. He didn't leave, I think. I didn't hear the stairs. That's when the aroma of smoke and alcohol descends upon the heavy air. He's in the door listening, and then he speaks. I know you're in there, girls. There's nowhere for you to go. If you come out now, I'll forgive the one that kicked my nuts and go easy on you both. Come on out. After a moment, he spoke again. His mood flipped. Okay, I'm gonna yank you out by your hair and rough it up. I'd like to say that someone overheard all of this and intervened, but they didn't. After what seemed like an eternity, he stood there for 10 minutes. We heard him descend the stairs, and we were hiding an additional 15 minutes before checking to see if it was safe to leave. Long story short, we made it to Kylie's house, which was not as close as she said, but we had our lives. My father came to get me after midnight. The next morning, Sabrina's mother called and feigned cluelessness as to why we would leave, claiming we didn't knock, lied about taking the phone, and thought it was normal to make her daughter's friends have to work for free. Sabrina and I didn't speak much after Kylie's parents believed all of Sabrina's mother's nonsense and grounded her for a month. This was a long time ago, but it has stayed haunting me since. I had just graduated from college and was still living outside the major city my school was near. There is public transit that is relatively reliable, so sometimes I would go into the city for special occasions, knowing I would get back safely. For Halloween that year, my boyfriend and I decided to take the train and actually go to an event, not just a house party. As a female, there are lots of footwear rules, and I was worried that if I didn't wear heels, I might not be allowed into the club we were going to. I debated for a long time, and switched between heels and flats several times. I was wearing a black dress that I turned into a Black Widow spider costume by putting a red cutout on the front of it. In the end, I ended up wearing black chucks. That night was great and relatively uneventful, and I didn't get hassled about my flats. At some point I decided I was exhausted and wanted to head home, but my boyfriend was going strong and really didn't want to leave, which was no problem since we took public transportation. He gave me the keys to his house, which was about a mile away from the train station, and we planned that I would head back and he would join me later. The mile I had to cover went by a mall, a school, and finally a church that abruptly ended and turned into a row of houses that the boyfriend lived on. There was a designated sidewalk the whole way, but it also ran along a 4-lane road. I knew there was potential for late-night vagabonds, but I figured they'd most likely be around the station or mall. So by that time I was at the church and could see my destination, which was the second house on the row, and I was considering myself safe. As I passed the church on the right sidewalk, I'm about 200 yards from the house, and I hear a vehicle start to slow down as it approaches on my left. The speed limit for the area is 35 miles an hour, but people will often fly down it. I'd say people would probably go 45, given that there were 2 lanes each way. The van had probably been going around that speed, because the sound of it slowing down was noticeable to say the least. I say van, because the sound of the de-acceleration caused me to turn and see white, hard-sided, really dark-tinted front windows from this van pulling over. Luckily, it was going so fast, it wasn't able to stop, until it had pulled about 20 yards past me, where it sat idling next to the sidewalk. I stopped walking because there was no reason for the van to stop there, and I didn't want to walk by the sliding door. After 30 seconds of the van idling and no one getting out, I decided to quickly scuttle up onto the church flower beds so that I wouldn't be close enough to be grabbed by anyone who might open the sliding door. At first nothing happened, and I felt dumb for being paranoid, and that's when I sent 1,000 prayers for deciding to wear flats that day. After 10 seconds of letting me walk on, I heard the van gun its engine and watched it zoom by and then screech to a stop about 10 feet away, cutting into the sidewalk with the tail sticking into the road. Hearing the driver's door open sent a jolt of adrenaline that I'd never felt before or since, and I took off sprinting in my glorious flats. As I passed the front of the van, I saw the driver pass the side mirror, meaning he was already outside his door attempting to make his way to the front. This is basically the end of the story, because I, up on my toes, sprinted all the way to the house and cut through some trees to lose him. I wasn't pursued any further as I could tell, and was able to get inside and lock the door. I will always be grateful I ended up wearing flats that night so I could run for my life. I don't really like considering what might have happened if I'd have been in heels. So Van Man, let's not meet again. Last year, we got some snow around this time of year. It was very pretty, but it's New York, so it's usually gorgeous here in the winter. I woke up one morning, did my morning routine, and went outside to check the mail, when I noticed footprints in the snow that did not belong to either me or my husband. They were far too large, extremely large. The person who made them would have to have been well over 6 feet tall, and I'm 5'11", and my husband is shorter than me. They started at the road and came up to our kitchen window. It looked like someone had just stopped to peek in. They continued around the side, then to the back of the house, where they looped around and went into the neighbor's yard. I followed them, and they went straight through my neighbor's backyard and into the field that spans off into the woods behind our house. And they just stopped, right in the middle of the field. They just vanished. We called the cops, and a police officer came by to look at them. He seemed a bit rattled and confused by it. He didn't really have an explanation as to why they had just stopped in the middle of the field. It had snowed a few days prior, and we hadn't gotten any more snow since, so it wasn't as if fresh snow had covered them. Otherwise, it would have covered the other tracks too. The officer asked around about our neighborhood, but the only other person nearby is an old woman in hospice care, so it couldn't have been her. The reason I'm sharing this is because I'm 100% certain that these tracks weren't made by a person. I don't know what they were, but I know that seeing them stop dead in the middle of a field like that made me feel sick to my stomach. I still think about it quite often when it snows, and I dread the day that I see them again. The other really peculiar thing about this to me is that I have dogs. In particular, I have two very vocal dogs who bark if they so much as hear a scratch in the wall or something outside. That night, they didn't make a sound. I should also say that our house is haunted. After doing some research into the property, I found that the last owner passed in the house due to complications of lung cancer. We have occasionally heard rasping, heavy breaths in the house, and I have personally seen apparitions, strange lights, and my husband has been physically hurt. We've had the house blessed last year, and things have calmed down quite a bit. I don't know if the footprints in the snow were related to this or not, but it remains an intensely disturbing experience for me. I lived in a van and traveled to the country working seasonal jobs. When I would get somewhere new, I used Tinder to meet and make friends. Anyway, I was in Auburn, and I had a few drinks at a bar hoping to meet locals. When I left the bar, it was dark. I was walking to my van when I heard someone say my first and then last name. Massive red flag. I live 6 states over. Nobody but the guy who checked the ID at the bar could know my last name. I turned around and saw this guy sitting on some bricks smoking a cigarette. "Yeah, that's me," I say without thinking. "Hey, my name's Chris. We matched on Tinder." I stood with him and we spoke, and he said he lived right there, pointing to the door behind the bar that leads to the studios on the 2nd story. We hung out, had a drink or two, and he invited me up for dinner, cooked it at the community kitchen, and I wasn't planning on going to his place, but I was talking about Magic the Gathering, and he said he had some cards and was wondering if I wanted to check them out. I agreed. His studio was literally the size of a closet. It had a bed, a fridge, and there was a little nook in the corner that had a shower and a toilet. It was less than 100 square feet. I looked through his cards and told him nothing I was interested in. He said it figures, because they were given to him and he doesn't play. The next day, I go to the local game store to play Magic the Gathering. And guess who walks in? He offers to get drinks and I decline. I tell him I'll add him on Facebook and message him if I change my mind. He gives me his name and looks over my shoulder while I type it in the app. He pops up and I tap on his profile, then I see it. 500 mutual friends. I don't live anywhere near him. I've been here 3 days. Then I think, oh, I am friends with a lot of drag performers on Facebook. Maybe he is too. I add him and leave. Once in my van, I get on Tinder for the first time since arriving, and I swipe and I swipe, and I pay the $4.99 to get more swipes, and I swipe and I swipe, and I don't see him. Where is he? This Chris guy. 2 hours later, I find him. I open his profile. 500 mutual friends. I swipe right. Nothing happens. It doesn't say you've got a match. Not only have we never matched, but he didn't even swipe on me. Was he trying to hide the profile? I felt like I kept seeing him that week. I didn't want it to cause me to change travel plans and leave early, but it started to freak me out. He would show up at the bar that I was at, or the game store when I was there, even though he told me he didn't play Magic. I started to get really uneasy, so I checked his Facebook profile again. All of the mutual friends were my close friends. My childhood friends, my family, my teachers, my co-workers. I couldn't handle it anymore, and changed my entire winter plans just to get out of there. Unrelated. 3 weeks later, I read in the news that his apartment and the bar we had met in had burned down. This happened when I was a lot younger, and sometimes I still think about it. At the time, I was around 10 years old, going to school, in Osaka, Japan. I lived in America, but every summer my mum would take my younger sister and I to Japan to see her mother and make us go to school, since Japanese schools go on until late July before their summer break. In the mornings, I would walk to school with my sister, and everything was usually okay. Although we'd get the occasional odd stare, since despite being half Japanese, in a smaller town like that, where no tourists ever come, we stuck out like a sore thumb. However, once school was over, I usually was unable to walk home with my sister because of after-school clubs and the clubs ending at different times. At least, I had a few friends who could walk me home, however, and gave me company, so I rarely was ever alone. But one day, I decided I didn't want to stay for my club, and that I just wanted to go home early and play some Wii. I knew my mum wouldn't mind, since I had decided to join a not too important club called Cooking Club. My friends, however, had more obligation than I did, since they actually lived in Japan and went for the whole school year, unlike me, and could not accompany me home. My walk home started out fine, but rather quickly my 10-year-old self felt that something was off. There was a man in a baseball cap, wearing one of those cold masks, with baggy clothes following me. He was still a fair distance away from me too, so since I was a pretty naive kid, I shrugged it off and kept walking. But pretty soon after, I heard footsteps pretty close behind me now. I figured it was a different person, but being curious, I turned my head to see the same man closing the distance between us fairly quickly. I remember starting to feel pretty nervous at that point. A quick point here before I continue. In the town I was at, there are lots of small alleys and streets that are all connected, so you can take plenty of wrong turns and still end up home, as long as you have a decent idea of where your house is. My brain does not function well at all when I'm nervous or stressed, so instinctively, I turned into a small alleyway, which was honestly the dumbest thing I could have done. But at the time I figured that the man would keep walking, and that would resolve all of this. But instead, he turned into the alleyway as well. At this point I started fast walking, but didn't want to straight up run, since I still wasn't 100% sure he was following me, and running would come off as kind of rude if the man wasn't following me. I began making random turns into streets and narrow alleys that I had never stepped foot into before, hoping that the man wouldn't follow me. Surely he was just an innocent man trying to get somewhere. However, even my dumb 10-year-old brain knew that after the 5th or 6th time I had made a random turn, with the man still following me, that I was in danger. At the time, I was in a narrow alleyway with walls that were way taller than I was, so I couldn't see what was up ahead or next to me. I decided I should start running, not thinking that a grown man would be faster than me. I also was weighed down by my backpack and water bottle, so I can only imagine how slow I was. I could hear his footsteps much louder against the asphalt, and I was beyond scared at this point. I was sure I was going to get kidnapped and then murdered. I remember running with everything I had, to the point I was afraid I would literally run myself into the ground. But the alleyway went out into a street I recognized, where there was a supermarket, and thankfully several people were either walking or on their bicycles. I slowed down immediately. I was a self-conscious kid and didn't want to attract more attention to myself than my foreign looks already were. I turned around once more to see the man who was simply standing there for a few moments before walking in the direction of the supermarket. But I knew there was no way that was his destination this whole time. I had taken the weirdest route, and there were much more direct ways he could have used if he had wanted to go there. I told my mum, who contacted the school. I got in trouble for deciding to go home alone that day, and afterwards, a teacher always made sure there was at least one kid with me when I made my way home. I'm a female, and when this story took place I was 19 years old. I will also mention that this was in 2002, so I didn't have a cell phone. I was driving from a friend's cabin in Northern California down a very dangerous curvy canyon road in the mountains. It is a beautiful area during the day, and you can see for miles. But nighttime brings out a certain evil like nowhere else. Not the type of place you want to find yourself stranded. It was around midnight when my car started acting strangely, and then all of a sudden, just died. I coasted for about 100 feet as I was going slightly downhill and was able to get off on the tiny shoulder, so I wasn't in the middle of the road. I kept trying to get my car to start, but every time I turned the key it would make a loud screeching sound. It sounded like metal on metal. Not good. I figured I was just making it worse, so I stopped. Great. It was completely dark, very late, and I was alone in the middle of nowhere. Literally, I had not seen a single car since I left, and as I peered out the window, I had a very uneasy feeling overcome me, and I decided at that point I was not leaving the car until daylight. I locked my doors. There's no telling what is out there at night. Bears, mountain lions, Bigfoot. These are just a few of the many things that live in those mountains. When it got daylight, I would set out on foot to find a phone. It was going to be a long night. With that said, I gathered up some of my stuff and rolled a joint. I was about halfway through my smoking session and I almost fell asleep when a sudden jolt of lights appeared. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. I could see way across the canyon, headlights coming down the winding road towards me. They could not see me as my lights were off. I knew I had about 5 minutes until they came around the last curve and I would be completely visible, sitting here in my car that wouldn't go. I didn't like the way this was panning out, and even though I had told myself earlier that I was not leaving the car, at that moment I decided I was getting out. I was going to hide somewhere until the car passed. I grabbed my keys, flashlight and wallet, locked my door and took off running into the night, using only the moonlight to see. I was really stoned and was silently second-guessing my decision to abandon my car as I ran across the road about 75 feet away and hid behind a tree that was behind a guardrail. Behind me, somewhere probably pretty close, was a straight drop-off in the canyon off the side of the mountain, so I had limited options as to where to hide, and it was basically pitch black out. The truck was approaching mine, and I squatted there as I watched it slow to a stop. My knees were already getting hurt. Great. I knew most people would be happy to see a passerby if they were in my position, but I had a bad feeling that night and would have much rather just waited until daylight to take care of myself. Call me stubborn and paranoid, but I think it saved my life that night. I was hoping that when the person saw my car and it was empty, they would just leave. That didn't happen. The door of the truck opened and I could see a tall man walking over to my car when he got close to it. He started moving his head all around like he was looking for something. He was probably looking for me. A dog jumped out of the back of the truck and immediately starts sniffing the car and heads directly towards me. My heart sank through my toes. I was physically shaking and really wished that I had not smoked so much of that joint earlier. As the dog nears me, the man tried to open the driver's side door, and when it didn't open, he started banging the window like he was trying to break it. I started to cry. I didn't know what I was gonna do. The dog ran right up to me, but surprisingly didn't bark nor bite. He smelt me and was on his way. I thought I was gonna have a heart attack. When he finally stopped beating my window, the man began pacing all around the road, yelling at me to come out, yelling things like, "Where'd you go? Come out, get over here." He yelled for a full minute, and then he just walked over to my car, punched the hood, and got back into the vehicle. I heard him whistle, and the dog jumped back into the back of the truck. Then he slowly drove away, honking his horn and flashing his lights. I was so scared that he was hiding just out of view, waiting for me to come out, that I hid there in the exact same spot until the sun came up. I literally didn't move a muscle, and my legs almost gave out on me after I decided to go back to my car. For just a minute, I could see if I could get it to start. I almost fell down as I ran back across the road. I've never been so scared in my life, and I got in the car, and to my absolute amazement, it started up on the first try. My foot must have already been on the gas pedal because I screeched my tires loudly as I got the hell out of there. I couldn't believe what just happened. When I got home, my boyfriend made me call the police and make a report. They came out and took my statement, but nothing ever came of it. I often wonder what would have happened to me if I'd have stayed in my car and not hidden. Please use this as a warning. If you find yourself alone driving in the middle of nowhere, you never know what someone's intentions are. So to the creepy guy that tried to break my windows and find me that night, I hope we never meet again. This story took place in the summer of 1985 in England, when I was around 11 or 12 years old. First, a little backstory. I was allowed to walk alone at a young age. The fields are opposite a row of houses behind my home, on a busy road and visible from the rear of my childhood home. Between the two rows of houses is a dead-end road, with no pathway I could have directly gained access from the rear of my house to the main road. So I had to walk from the front of my house in a sort of U-shape temporarily out of my sight, to even reach the fields. Even so, once I was on the fields, my parents could keep an eye on me. So, on with the story. It was a warm summer evening, still light, so I decided to take my dog for a walk. I reached the fields with ease, and we waited a good half hour before heading home. From the fields, I turned right onto the main road, and was suddenly hit with a sense of realizing how eerily quiet the main street was. For a warm summer evening, there appeared to be no child playing, no cars being washed, and no grass being cut. I have absolutely no idea why I picked up on that, but it all became relevant to what next happened. Walking the short distance down the road, I stopped and turned to face the junction of the small road directly opposite, where I stood, that I would turn left on to be back on my own street. I stood on the grass verge. Before the new bypass, this road was often busy and difficult to cross. I had already almost been knocked over in the exact same spot months before, when a car skimmed my legs as I ran across without looking, so I'd been extra cautious ever since. So there I waited for the cars in both directions to pass, still thinking about how quiet everything seemed. Suddenly, a voice spoke very loudly and firmly in my left ear. "Watch out for the next car that comes over the brow of the hill." I still recall it word for word. Shocked, I immediately turned to see who it was. Only moments before there was absolutely no one in view, so it came as a surprise to hear a voice right next to me. However, once I turned to face the owner of the voice, I was stunned to see no one there. I gaped at the open air in shock. What had just happened? Who on earth had spoken to me? Could they have run out of sight in a split second? Now, this wasn't a voice in my head, a feeling, or even a voice in the distance. This was a real physical voice, speaking to me as close to my ear as my shoulder, and is as real as any living human voice. And brow of the hill? This is a term that I had never used, or I believe heard, at such a young age. The voice said nothing else. It was then I felt awash with a sudden sense of dread and panic. I toyed with the idea of taking my chance and running across the road, but I knew this to be too risky. I had already had near misses in the same spot, and at this point, I was as far on the grass verge as I possibly could have been, with my toes dangling over the curb. It was then I knew, whatever the reason behind the warning, I would have to step back and wait it out. I knew I was trapped. I prayed the voice was wrong, but my gut feeling knew it was right, and that the message was meant for me. I slowly began to walk until I left the grass verge and was back on the pavement. My sixth sense must have taken over from that voice, as somehow I knew the car I was warned of was about to come from the right. The voice hadn't told me which direction, or even which style of car, but I knew. At this point, the back of my legs were pressed firmly up against the dwarf brick wall behind me. My breathing became shallow, as I kept my focus firmly on the right. From where I stood, both directions had a good stretch of road, so I could see for quite a distance in both directions. Plenty of cars were still passing from either way, and I had no bad feeling from any of them. The first car since this warning passed from the right, and I sensed nothing bad. The second car followed, still nothing unusual, and then the third car came into view. My heart sank. I knew this blue saloon car was the one I needed to be wary of. My heart began to thud rapidly, as though it were about to burst through my chest. My legs were now pressing harder against the wall, and I prayed this was all a huge misunderstanding, and the car would pass just like the others without incident. I kept my eyes firmly on it, and watched as it approached. I became aware that it was losing speed, and not traveling at the expected 30 miles an hour. It was definitely slowing down. I braced myself, and the car then came to a halt right where I had been standing, and I would have been only centimeters away from it had I still been there. Only the voice's warning ensured that I had to turn that distance into a far greater one. As the car came to a halt, the male driver reached over and flung open his passenger side door and beckoned me to approach his car. But I had a head start, ready to launch in the opposite direction. What's more, he even had the audacity to stretch right over as if to attempt to grab me. This still makes me shudder whenever I think about it. My toes barely touched the ground as I fled into one of the driveways of the bungalow behind me, and I banged on the door hard. There was no answer, and I banged again. Then I heard the voice echoing from the bathroom window. I went further down the driveway and banged there. "Help me, please," I yelled. A few seconds later, the side porch door began to open, and it was at this point I collapsed in a sobbing heap on the driveway. Relieved my call to help was successful, yet at the same time I still felt vulnerable and unsafe. A man and woman stood up, looking at me, perplexed. "A man tried to grab me and pull me in his car," I struggled to say. I needed to say no more. The man of the house ran out of his driveway only to discover that the guy who was ready to take me was still waiting for me. Believing my first attempt at calling for help was unsuccessful and that I would emerge from the driveway alone. He tried to say he only wanted directions, but this was bullcrap at its worst. He attempted to grab me, and if he was telling the truth, why did he quickly close his car door and speed off? Unfortunately, it happened so fast, we never took down his number plate. The woman of the house kindly walked me the few remaining yards home, where she informed my parents of the incident. Needless to say, I was not allowed to walk the dog alone for a long time after that, nor did I want to. The people of the house divorced a few years after, and two families temporarily moved into the same street as where I live now, albeit at different times in different houses. I managed to speak to the woman not so long ago, but she has little memory of helping me. Even so, I'm always grateful of her help, and very grateful to the voice of an angel, if indeed it were, as without its warning, I may not be here today. I shudder to think what would have happened had I been standing on the edge of the curb, oblivious to the danger. As for the stranger in the car, let's not meet again. This happened to me 3 years ago. I was in college but took night class because I was working full-time by day. That night, my class ended at around 10 p.m. The school is a bit far away from my home. I could walk, but it was winter, and lots of snow had fallen that week. The walkways were full of snow. It would have taken me forever to walk home. My bus app told me I had just missed the bus, and the next one was a half-hour away. When this happened, I would always walk to the nearest subway because there was another bus stop, and instead of waiting and freezing, I would walk to warm myself up a little. So that's exactly what I did that night. The shortest way to the subway station was through a park. I always took that path and had no reason to worry that this night was going to be any different. Before arriving to the park entrance, I noticed there was a guy with a very recognizable hockey-themed winter hat, smoking near benches. As soon as he saw me, he picked up his things and slowly walked towards the walkway. I have no idea why, but I found him suspicious, and I remembered something my mum told me when I was a kid. When you feel like something is off about someone at night, find any reason you can to slow down and let them walk past you. You'd rather have someone in front of you than behind. For some reason I thought he was weird and did as my mum told me. I faked receiving a text and slowed down so that he would be in front of me. He was so incredibly slow, as if he wanted me to get past him, but I would just slow down even more. He was vaping something that smelled like super fake strawberry, and I was hoping he wouldn't go into the park, but he did. We walked like that in the park until I noticed there was a hockey game going on, and I decided I would go and watch the match, just to let him take some distance before I carried on going. As I was turning right to get to the outdoor ice rink, he turns left on a path that goes by a building. I was reassured that he wasn't going in the same direction that I needed to go. Still, I was a bit curious about the match, so I watched for a minute or so, then turned back to go on my path, and as I turned, my blood ran cold. The same guy that turned left was turning the other corner of the building. He had just walked around it. If I had kept going instead of watching the hockey by doing this, he would have been behind me. I was petrified, but I was still relatively safe because there were people around. The guy walked slowly as ever in the direction I needed to go, but I did not follow him straight away. I waited for a bunch of students to walk by and walked behind them. He was waiting by the park exit checking his phone, and when I saw the bunch of students, he walked away at normal speed. I saw him turn right on a street and thought it was the end of it. Eventually I reached the subway station and started waiting for the bus, and then I smelt it. The very familiar potent strawberry smell. And as I turned to look around, there was the guy with the hockey-themed hat and another guy, both staring at me. When the bus arrived, I was shaking, and it was not because of the cold. They both got on the bus with me and other passengers, and I told the bus driver about what happened, where I live, and past 9 p.m., women can ask the bus driver to be dropped alone at a bus stop, making sure no one can follow her. And that's exactly what the bus driver did. I had the bright idea to get out one stop early, and I walked in the opposite direction from my way home and waited for the bus to leave. As I turned around to wave at the bus driver as a way of thanking him, I saw the two guys banging in the middle door. The bus driver had locked them so they wouldn't open. I took that bus almost every night, and I never saw those two guys again, nor have I ever seen them near my house. But they were banging on the doors, and although I couldn't hear them, I could clearly see them yell at the bus driver. When the lights finally turned green and the bus left, I rushed back home, faster than I ever did in the snow. The next night after school, I was too nervous to use my shortcut through the park, so I took the long way around and got my bus safely. But what I saw on that ride scared the living hell out of me. At the bus stop that I had dropped off the previous day were the two guys, one with a hockey-themed hat. They did not get on the bus. My first thought was that they were waiting for me and not the bus. But luckily for me, this was not my stop. Perhaps I was paranoid and this is just a strange series of coincidences, but I was scared to get on that bus, and still am today. I moved in with my boyfriend since then, but the shortest way to our house is through the park. I still take the long way round though, when I'm traveling at night. I used to work at Borders, way back when. Though I had another job at the mall, something about being at the bookstore made me much more recognizable. I often had people approach me when I was on the street, or ask me about the store's sales. While I was at the drive-thru window, it was mostly harmless stuff, though I got some creeps occasionally. At the time, I had a dating profile set up, but I had to take it down because I'd started getting weird messages from men saying they saw me at the grocery store or something and wanted to touch themselves. Just bizarre stuff. The killing blow that finally made me close it, however, came shortly before my 19th birthday. I was checking my account after work, and I see a message titled, "We've met," which immediately creeped me out. I clicked on it and it said, "Sort of," before proceeding into this very weird graphic description of this guy who was apparently so thrilled by my cashiering skills that it caused a stirring in his loins. This email was seriously like 3 pages long, talking about how excited he was and all of the things he would like to do to my young body. I was horrified to think that one of my customers had been looking at me like that, thinking those things. I clicked on his profile. No photo, but it said he was 56 and single. I needed to know what he looked like, which is the only reason I applied, and I imagine that was his game all along. I didn't respond to any of the other stuff he said, but I asked him if he sent me a picture, and he told me he couldn't put one up because he's sort of a public figure, but he told me he'd email it to me. It took him 2 very long days to get back to me. While I waited, I looked at my message history and discovered that this guy had actually written to me many times. I ignored him because 1, no pictures, and 2, way out of the age group I was looking for. Out of morbid curiosity, I looked at the messages. All of them were filled with graphic things he wanted to do to me. He talked about fantasies of using me with another man he knew, acting out horrific things. Some of the details were specific to me, which led me to believe he wasn't just sending them en masse to every young woman on the site. Meanwhile, this guy is older than my dad. I spent the next 2 days tensing around every older man who came in. I was afraid to be friendly to any of them, for fear that one of them would be this guy and he'd take it as a go-ahead to come at me. I was having a birthday celebration the day he finally got back to me, and the moment I saw his name, I got a bad feeling in my gut. I couldn't immediately place it, but I knew there was something wrong with this person writing these things to me. I stared at it for a moment, positive I knew this guy, but my brain would not let me click. I texted one of my friends to confirm with her as it began to dawn on me. This man was my high school principal. I was horrified. I was still 18 at the time, which means that he must have been creeping on a bunch of us all along. I remember being alone with him in his office, and it makes me feel queasy. Is he just perched and waiting for girls to graduate so he can legally pounce? I wrote back to him and said, I don't know if you remember me, but you are my high school principal, and I happen to know you're married. He didn't reply, and I thought that was the end of it. I was still super creeped out about that for a while, just thinking about how long he'd been thinking about me and sending me these graphic messages, when he'd been an authority figure in my formative years. Almost a year passed without incident, and he didn't come in when I was there. But one day, I started ringing someone up, without getting a good look at their face. It was a friendly exchange right until I made eye contact. It was him. He was grinning. I put his stuff in his bag and turned away from the register. He stayed where he was, and I pretended to organize some returns, but he kept standing there silently. I knew he was watching me, but I didn't want to look. The moment lasted far too long, so I finally grabbed my headset and asked the manager to come to the front of the store. He hurried out after that, and I never saw him again. It turns out, though, he had recently retired. He no longer worked with children. Regardless, I still contemplated putting the information out there, but I realized there wasn't a whole lot I could do at that point. Technically, he wasn't committing any crimes, just describing kinky fantasies to a legal adult. I thought about it for a long time, discussed it with the people in my life, including a parent who worked with the school, and it just didn't seem worth the risk. It was a smaller area, and I didn't know what might happen to me. Now, I probably would have done something anyway, but I was a kid at the time. As for his wife, I thought about contacting her. My friend's mum knew her, and I had email evidence. However, he only sent his photo through an identifiable account, and I've learnt from a friend's experience prior that it was risky to get involved in marital affairs. I didn't know their situation, and there was a chance his wife may have already suspected his infidelity, but remained in denial because she didn't want her marriage to end. In those situations, sometimes the woman will lash out at her husband's victim because she can't lash out at her husband. My mum and several other older women told me not to get involved too, so I didn't. This might not have been the right move, and even today, I'm not sure if it was. This was over a decade ago, by the way. I still do have the final email somewhere, but I'm not sure I have the ones he sent me on the dating site. They may have just been connected to the account, possibly lost when I deleted it. I think I might have screen capped them, but it was 4 computers ago, so I'm unsure now. I no longer live in the area, and frankly, I feel like it's more likely to invite unwelcome attention onto me than onto him. He could be dead by now, for all I know. I lived quite close to my school in primary, so my older sister and I would walk home because my parents worked. My sister is 5 years older than me, so my parents trusted her enough to leave us home alone instead of going to after-school care. One day when I was in 3rd grade, I was asked by my teacher to stay back at the end of school. I told my sister, and she said she would just go home and wait there. I should also mention that the way from home from school was pretty much along a main road, and it should have been fine. I head back to my classroom and start talking with the teacher. At this point, it was nearly 5. I'm only about halfway home, when I noticed the white pickup following me. I was only about 7, mind you, and you start being taught stranger danger and stuff like that, so it was still pretty fresh in my mind. The pickup gave off suspicious vibes, and the street felt empty. I remember it still being bright out, but this pickup was the only car on the road. Worse still, it wasn't even on the road. It was on the side, moving very slowly behind me. At this point, it was a red alarm in my young mind, as even then I was pretty cautious of everything. I looked back again, and this time I think whoever it was knew I was aware of them. This was bad, because I think they panicked and were driving a little quicker now to close the gap. I was also getting more panicked too. Then I remember thinking there's a path between the next houses. It leads to the back of other people's homes, and then to the street next to mine. I walk a little faster, and I guess they noticed too. I remember them speeding up a little bit, but still keeping a gap. I quickly turn down between the houses and start running as soon as I think I'm out of their sight. I hear the pickup go faster and then come to a stop. By now I've turned the corner and hid so they couldn't see me. I hear the doors swing open, and I just hoped they wouldn't follow. I hear someone step on the grass. They were following, and I was panicking. Just then a voice says that they should just leave and forget about it. They speed away, and I walk the rest of the way home. Now, you might be thinking what made me think of this just now. Well, a while ago, I heard my parents talking about some pretty dark stuff that was shut down on the internet, out of the Gold Coast in Queensland. I step in to ask what they were talking about, and they said that when I was a kid it came out on the news that the police had taken down a huge CP website. I then went and searched this up, and turns out that the guy in charge of the website ran it out of the suburb I lived in. I got chills reading the article. Remembering back, this all happened 2 years after the van incident. 29 kids were saved from abuse that were featured on that website. It just really gives me the chills to think that maybe the guy in the pickup truck was one of them. Back around 2004, I worked as a maintenance man at a small music college on Long Island, New York. It was an easy job, changing light bulbs, painting, minor electrical work. One of the jobs was coming in early on days that it snowed, plow the parking lots, and shovel off the sidewalks, so the students could go about their day. This one morning, I got in at around 2 a.m. to start shoveling off the walks and the parking lot. Now for a little backstory. Back in the 18th century, the area that the school was on was a large family farm. Like many farms back then, when you died you were buried on the property, in a little private graveyard. So the graveyard for the old farm is still on site, and was grown over by trees, and you couldn't really see it from the school building. All the security guards who worked overnight used to talk about seeing a ghost walking around the school hallways at night. Some even saw a ghost dog running up and down the halls. I rarely believed them, and just thought they were messing with us. Back to the snow day. The way my partner and me would clear the walkways, he would use the snowblower outside, and I would walk through the empty building and clean off all the exit doors, and we would continue until we got down to the last door at the very end of the school. As I headed to the last doorway, I noticed that the inside doormat is wet, and it looks like someone had stamped on it, which I find odd, because the door is locked, and all the security guards are way back on the other side of the building. I look through the glass door and notice footprints on the fresh snow right outside the glass door, but don't see any wet footprints going down the hall, except for the wet snow on the doormat. Now I begin to freak out a bit. Just as I see this, my partner with the snowblower comes around the corner. I show him the prints, and we decide to follow them. The footprints go along this side of the building and head off towards the tree line where the graveyard is. As we go along following the prints, I notice there are no other prints in the snow except the ones we're following. Now we get to the edge of the forest and notice the prints heading right to the old graveyard. We go inside the woods and go right up to this little broken down fence that was put up to keep people out of the graveyard. As we look inside the fence, I see the prints originate from the foot of one of the graves. It looks like the person just rose up from the ground and went out for a stroll. Freaked me and my partner out for a while after that. A few nights ago, my boyfriend and I took a brief road trip to a neighboring state to see Sam Smith. Before we left, I was working 10 days straight at my job and getting about 4 to 5 hours of sleep. I was super exhausted and very easily upset over small things. The drive there was fine, albeit exhausting, but we made it to our hotel with plenty of time to spare. We opted to shower and get some food before leaving the hotel for the concert, and I thought we should use Uber since it was in the downtown area, a place I'd never been, and I knew the traffic was going to be ridiculous. And considering I'm running on fumes at this point, I thought Ubering wouldn't be a terrible idea. Our Uber driver arrives, and the ride there is pleasant. We get to the concert venue and easily find our seats, and the show begins. I want to take a lot of videos on my phone, but only managed a few as my phone was on 10% battery, and I knew I would need it for the Uber later, so I switched it off. I'd just like to state that Sam Smith is amazing live, and if you get a chance to see him, do it. The concert ends, and after battling through the crowd to get out, I switch on my phone, which is now at 7%, to get the Uber. It's 11 PM, and as this was my first time, I wasn't expecting prices to jump ridiculously high. So my boyfriend suggested that we take a walk around the block or so, and check out downtown while we wait. I agree. We walk, and about half-hour later, we stop by the entrance to a small courtyard or park, about half a block away from a gas station. My boyfriend tells me to book the Uber, but my phone perishes before I can. Being the paranoid and easily stressed, anxious woman that I am, I start to have a panic attack. I can't breathe enough or slow down my breathing. I'm sweaty, my heart is pounding, and I begin to overthink that we are now stranded downtown with no way home. I thought about getting a cab or bus, but I had no cash on me, and it was getting late. My boyfriend, bless his soul, is much more logical and rational when dealing with stressful situations, and suggests he go to the gas station and sees if he can get a charger for my phone and plug it in there. I can barely talk or walk at this point, as my body is not functioning. So he helps me sit down on the bench and tells me he'll be right back and not to go anywhere. Nothing sketchy happens while he's gone, and when he returns, he helps me to the gas station and lets me know he told the police officer in there what happened. The officer was really understanding, and he basically bought a charger for us and stood by my phone while it booted up. After taking some deep breaths, I get my phone and try to get Uber. This is where I'm told I now have no money in my debit card, and I start to panic more. Here we are alone, in a more shady part of downtown, with bars on the windows of the gas station at night, with no money and no way to get home. My rational boyfriend reminds me I have a credit card, and after checking the balance, it looks like I have just enough to get Uber and gas for my own car when we leave. But I now have only one card to get me through the rest of the week before payday. I book another Uber, and it says he's about 5 minutes or so away, so I start calming down. I tell my boyfriend that I'm going to step out to get some air, and he tells me he'll be right out. He's going to get me some water, as there was a fairly long line in the gas station, and with all the people staring at me, I didn't want to be in there any longer than I needed to. So I went out and stood by the ice machine. This is where things started to go bad. A few moments later, a white car with its windows rolled down parks in the parking lot of the gas station. There are two rough-looking guys in the car, one white with what I think is brown hair and stubble, and the other black with dark blue or maybe grey or a black shirt, wearing a hat. I feel them staring at me while I try to get my breathing under control. At this point my hands have gone numb, and I'm finding it difficult to keep my balance. I just wanted to get home. Then two other guys came around the corner and walked over to the car. They were both black, one with dreads wearing a wife beater and jeans, the other with a shaved head, and I think a white or maybe light grey shirt. They talk for a little and exchange glances in my direction, and I hear them laughing about how messed up and strung out I was. I guess they thought I must have been high, and either having a really bad trip or coming down. And I didn't blame them. I felt really terrible, and I'm sure I looked the part. I just tried to ignore them when my hands weren't shaking so badly that I could check my phone to see where the Uber was. It said he was only 3 minutes away. I glanced through the barred window and see my boyfriend only a few people away from the front of the line, and I feel like everything would be fine. But I was wrong. The two guys who were outside of the car started catcalling me and trying to get my attention. I continued ignoring them. Then they started coming towards me. I knew I should have moved or said something or done something, but I was frozen. My throat was closing up, and I felt panic setting back in. They started saying I was sexy and asking what I was doing alone, asking where I was going, what I was on, and one of them started touching my arm and getting really close. I barely mumbled out that I wanted them to leave me alone. They just laughed it off and said they would take me where I needed to go. I felt them starting to pull me towards the car where the guys were waiting. I attempted to fight them off, but I was so weak I could barely walk or stand on my own. I felt like I was going to puke. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I kept mumbling that I wanted them to let me go and leave me alone, but they didn't listen or care, and just kept saying that we were all going to have fun. One of them made a point of grabbing my ass and squeezing it. And we were right at the car, and the smell of pot and cigarettes and alcohol was filling my lungs as one of the back doors opened, and I couldn't do anything. I feel like I deserved this because I couldn't fight back. I tried one last time to break free, but their hands were like claws digging into my skin. Just as I was about to be shoved into the car, I heard a familiar voice shout, "What the hell?" Before I knew what was happening, the guys threw me on the ground and climbed into the car, peeling out of the parking lot and the street before the doors had even shut. I couldn't even process it as my boyfriend ran over to me and helped me off the ground. I just started crying. The police officer was outside too, talking into his radio about what happened, and asked me if I was okay. I said I was, but I didn't know if I meant it or not. If they had just been a second too late, I would have been in that car with them, going to who knows where, and had who knows what done to me. The Uber arrived not long after that, and after speaking briefly with the officer, we got in the car and went to the hotel. We got there safely, and once we were back in the hotel, I stopped shaking. I couldn't sleep though, and even though I'm back home hundreds of miles from the creeps, I can't help but be paranoid that they'll find me somehow or that I'll run into them again. I don't like thinking about what could have happened to me, but I can't make my mind shut off or make it go away. I guess what I've learned from this, and what I can let everyone else know, is to make sure your phone is fully charged, maybe bring a battery pack, and that you have enough money, and that you don't go anywhere alone. You could be taken in an instant. Back in March of 2017, me and my girlfriend decided to take our annual trip to Orlando, Florida, earlier in the year than usual. I've always been a huge wrestling fan, and it was always a dream since I was a kid to attend WrestleMania. WrestleMania 33 was taking place in Orlando that year, and I figured it would be my best chance to finally go see it. It was, well, Orlando, and easier to convince my girlfriend to do this trip since I could take her to Disneyland and Universal as well. Fast forward to WrestleMania itself, and the show was great. It's an experience I'll never forget, both for good and bad reasons. Once the show ended, us, along with 70,000 other spectators, were leaving the show and trying to get Ubers back to the hotel. And if anyone is familiar with Uber, I'm sure you're aware that the prices get jacked up whenever there's a large supply and demand. Put it this way, it would have cost $100 for a 15-minute ride. Now, WrestleMania took place at what is used to be known as the Citrus Bowl, now Camping World Stadium, I believe. I wasn't familiar with the area since I'm from New York and didn't realize how ghetto the neighborhood really is, like something out of a movie. Seriously, look it up. So we decided that because the prices were so high, we'd try and walk as far away from the stadium as possible and get a cheaper Uber. About a half hour into us walking, about a little more than a mile away from the stadium itself, it's approaching 12:30 to 1 a.m. The neighborhood was practically a ghost town at this point, with a few wrestling fans here and there still walking. My girlfriend was complaining about her feet hurting, and she wanted to call her mum, so we stop and sit at a bus stop bench to do this. 2 minutes into the conversation with her mum, I realize that there's some guy in a hoodie that walks up behind us after he walked out from an abandoned house. He asks to use my girlfriend's phone, and she says she's on the phone right now. So the guy stands behind us for another 5 minutes or so, and finally I had enough and said, "You're not using her phone." "Excuse me?" he says. "You're not using her phone. We don't know you." He gets frustrated. "Why you make me wait here all this time then, if you aren't gonna let me use it?" I was getting equally heated and told him to piss off because we didn't know him anything. My girlfriend was getting scared at this point because she knows I'm a hothead and that this wasn't gonna end well. She grabs my arms and tells me, "Let's go." We start walking again, but now this guy is following us on his bicycle. I turn around and ask him what his problem was, and we start arguing, and at this point I tell him to leave again, except this time he pulled a gun from his belt and points it at me. I don't know what I was really thinking at the time. The only thing that came to my mind was, that's just going to make your situation worse. At this point, I think I had received my biggest stroke of luck, as a police officer just happened to be at a red light across the street, so the guy flew off on his bicycle after realizing there was a cop there. The light turned green, and the cop continued on his way. Me and my girlfriend ran across the street to the only convenience store open, which had a few wrestling fans in there. We begged the guy behind the counter to call the cops, and everyone in the store asked us what happened. After explaining it to them, everyone was scared to leave the store. And an hour and a half goes by, and then I ask the guy finally where the cops are, and he just replies, "I didn't call them." So we'd wasted all that time. I called the cops myself, and the dispatcher basically accused me of being on drugs because I waited so long to call. She then asked me to go back to the corner where the guy had pulled the gun on me so she could get the name of the street, and since I was on vacation I didn't know the area. I still think that was a ridiculous request by the dispatcher, trying to get me go back to an area where I was nearly robbed. Anyway, I gave her the address and where the store was, and could explain the corner, and even showed the corner to the cop when he would arrive. She sent an officer for us, and go figure it was the cop from the red light earlier on, who admitted he saw the guy confronting us and saw my girlfriend wave him down to help us, but didn't think too much of it. Gee, thanks, officer. He then pulls up on the laptop in his car and shows us a picture of the male who looked like the guy who pulled the gun on us. The cop explained that about 10 minutes after the guy fled the scene from me and my girlfriend, he confronted another couple and asked to use their phone. They actually let him, and he pulled the gun on them and took both their phones and the girl's purse. The cop then ordered us an Uber, and we went on our way. My girlfriend was traumatized the rest of our trip, and still holds it over my head that I almost got shot because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. There's a lesson to be learnt from this. It would definitely be wise to do some research on areas you're unfamiliar with that you might just be going to. You never know what's gonna happen. Our oldest son, Caden, was 3 at the time, and our youngest son, Connor, was 5 months. It still gives me chills and makes me uncomfortable each time I walk by this window. For the story. It was January evening. It was dark outside with a few inches of snow on the ground. We had just finished eating dinner, and I was planning on giving our little one a bath. My husband drives trucks for work, so isn't home very often. It's me and the boys during the week. Caden was playing in his toy room that has a door leading to the side deck. A little detail. We have no sensor light or even a porch light on the whole side of the house. At this time we didn't use the deck at all, only for our grill during the summer months. It's not close to the sidewalk or the next street over, basically an open space yard off the deck. Anyway, Caden was playing in the toy room waiting for his turn to take a bath while I brought Connor into the bathroom. We were just about done with bath time when I heard Caden's little feet running towards the bathroom. He stands in the doorway and says, "Mummy, there's a man looking in the side door." I think it's a mailman, but then my heart skipped a beat as I realized 1, no mailman would be coming at 7 p.m. 2, it's the side door he called at, and I didn't even hear a knock. I began to sketch myself out more by thinking about how there's no light on the deck, and this person would have to walk through the yard, in the snow, walk up the back stairs of the deck, and go to that door when the front porch light was on and attached to a shoveled sidewalk. I took Connor out of the bath, put him in a towel in his little chair, and told Caden to sit with his brother and not come out until I said it was okay. He was confused but listened and just kept asking what was wrong. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, had 911 ready to call, and put on my mama bear face. When I walked to the side door, I shined the flashlight on my phone through the window of the door at a distance, walking up to it to hopefully scare someone away. The worst thought was that I would reach the handle and realize it was unlocked. Someone could have walked right in. I flung the door open and shined my light, held up my knife and yelled, "Hey!" in the most threatening voice a 5'4", 120-pound woman could make. There were footprints in the snow up to the deck stairs and back down going into the field and woods behind our house. I slammed the door, thoroughly freaked out, and locked it. I called the police and waited in the bathroom with the boys. While I was in there, I asked Caden, "Do we know who the man was?" "No," he said, "but he smiled and waved at me for a long time." I asked him what he was wearing, and he told me a hat that looked like a mailman's, and he wasn't wearing a coat. The police officer came and searched the property with flashlights. He asked me and Caden questions, and then informed me he not only saw the footprints leading up to the side deck, but to the outside door to our basement, and the kitchen window on the other side of the house as well. He suggested I have someone come and stay with us for the night, and they will continue to follow the footprints that were left in the snow back to the field and the woodline. My father-in-law slept on the couch that night, firearm ready. My mother was a nervous wreck, and I got very little sleep that night. I never heard back from the police. I'm guessing tracks were lost through that bit of woods. Caden still mentions it from time to time randomly, and we got a blackout curtain for that door. I'd still very much like to get better locks to be safe. My husband and my father think it might have been a man who saw me home alone while passing and wanted to hopefully sneak a peek. But why just stand and watch my child and go around the whole back of the house and not by the front door or street? I hope to never see that creep's face, and hope he never smiles or waves at my child again. This happened about 14 years ago, when I was in my second year of university and living in a student flat. I was 19 at the time, and very into MySpace, and used to chat to friends and friends of friends on there. A few of my friends were models, which is how I stumbled across this guy called Joe. Joe was a professional photographer, with his edgy and provocative photos. With hindsight, I could see he was just a Terry Richardson wannabe, which should have been a giant red flag in itself. But at the time, I thought his style was cool, and he was working something impressive. He was shooting big celebrities and for fashion magazines, so I was really surprised when he replied to my message, complimenting him on his work. We started speaking regularly, and soon he was very keen to come and visit me. He was living in London and I was studying in Winchester, which is just an hour by train, so I didn't think it would be a very big deal. I eventually agreed and met him at the station. From the start he was very intense. He grabbed my face and started kissing me hard, and as soon as he saw me I was pretty taken aback. He suggested we go back to my place to watch a film, and I agreed. This was the first of many stupid mistakes. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm also not gonna go into explicit detail. Stuff happened. It was all fine and consensual to start, but it quickly escalated into some rougher stuff and him pushing pretty hard for more. I said no, and he proceeded to give me the whole "I came all this way to see you and you're being like this" guilt speech. I wish I could go back in time and tell my teenage self to kick him out, but I was young and stupid and didn't want to be rude. However, I did stand my ground and we didn't do it, but he also wouldn't leave. He said it was too far to travel back and it was getting late, so we would have to stay over. I had one of the most uncomfortable sleepless nights in my life, and was too embarrassed to tell my housemates what was going on. Thankfully he left first thing in the morning, and I hoped to never speak to him again. He tried messaging a few times and I didn't reply, but this isn't the end of the story. Cut to a few years later, and I see some friends on Facebook posting about Joe. They're sharing horror stories about him. Turns out a few other girls I knew had similar experiences with him, along with the news that he'd been charged with a few counts of sexual assault. Apparently his success as a photographer gave him just the position of power he needed to force himself on young models under the premise of getting them more work at magazine covers. Several news sites picked up on it, particularly because of his celebrity connections, and he was sentenced to 33 months in prison and banned from working with children and vulnerable adults. I definitely got off lucky. and felt extremely guilty for not sharing my experience with my friends earlier. Cut to about 6 years ago, and I was working in social media at a big agency in London. I hated it, and was using LinkedIn a lot to try and find a new job when I got a message from a guy I didn't know about some potential freelance work. He said he was starting a new agency which could potentially lead me to more full-time work down the line. He suggested we meet up at a well-known hotel to talk more. This seemed a little odd to me, but I was really keen to leave where I was working. In the middle of planning this, he messages me saying, "You don't recognize me, do you?" His avatar wasn't a close-up photo, so I opened it and took a closer look and froze. It's Joe, but with a different name. Apparently he changed it after he was released. I was so shocked and angry, I couldn't believe he almost lured me to meet him. I told him I had no intention of meeting up with him, and he told me not to believe everything I read. Needless to say, I disconnected him on LinkedIn. I just went through my old LinkedIn messages to find the ones from him and did a search for his name on Google. I don't know if it's the same guy, but the second search result comes up against his name and details of arrests for a violent crime in 2015. His LinkedIn is now disabled and he seems to have disappeared again. Let's hope this time we don't meet once more. I work night shifts at a women's shelter that is about a 30-minute commute away from my apartment. I take the metro every night to work and every morning from work. The closest metro station being situated a 5-minute walk from my apartment. My work is situated in the downtown area of the city that I currently reside in while I live in the neighborhood that has a reputation of being filled with alcoholics and drug addicts. I have had no encounters worth mentioning in either places until now. I was walking towards the metro station last night after saying goodbye to my boyfriend who was heading home after spending the evening with me. I think it's worth mentioning that my boyfriend drives to and from my place every Tuesday and Thursday, and I work from Sunday to Wednesday, meaning that I was heading to work when this happened. I was walking towards the metro station when a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere on the street corner across from the metro station and grabbed me by the arm. This happened to be on the only street corner from my apartment to the metro station that you cannot see anything on the street perpendicular to the one I was on until you got onto the street corner. So I'm getting onto the street corner. The metro station is across from me, and I am getting ready to cross the street as there was a green light when the man appeared out of nowhere and grabbed me by the arm. I freeze for a second before noticing that he is reaching over my body to grab my other arm, but before he could do that, I reacted and elbowed him in the stomach. I guess he didn't expect a quick reaction because he quickly let go. After he let go, I sprinted across the street and ran into the metro station. The metro station has 2 entrances that are parallel to one and another. Both are facing the turnstiles that access the metro downstairs. I had noticed from the corner of my eye that the guy had followed me, and before he got inside, I headed to the other exit, ran around the station, and headed back towards my apartment. Since I live in the Great White North, and it had been snowing all day, I was hoping that my boyfriend had not left yet, as he would have to take the snow off his car before leaving. Luckily, he did not, and he ended up driving me to work. We also met a cop car as we were about to turn on the street to get to the highway, so we stopped and reported the guy. The cops took down my information and what I could remember of his description, and they promised to go check it out and do a few rounds around the metro station. I don't know what that guy's intentions were, but I hope I never encounter that guy ever again. This story happened to me about 6 years ago, but I think about it frequently because it's the only paranormal thing I witnessed that I'm 100% sure was real. I can't help but thinking, maybe someone else has had a similar experience. It was in the middle of winter and terribly cold. There was a huge storm outside. I went to my kitchen to make myself some tea. It was about 11 p.m. Note that I'm used to going to bed at roughly 3 to 4 a.m., so I wasn't tired at all. I was approaching the table when my gaze accidentally fell on the street outside. I saw two men in dark clothes walking there along the road. They struck me as unnatural right away because of how they were walking. Calmly, slow, leisurely, talking and gesturing to each other. With how strong the wind was, people just couldn't walk like that. I adjusted the curtain to take a better look. It hid the men from my view for less than a second, and when I looked again, they were gone. The road where they were walking is very long and surrounded by nothing. There was nowhere for them to hide during this split second. I was shocked and curious. The next night I checked again but saw no one. The night after that, I saw them again. The men were walking in a similar snowstorm, just as slowly. I stared at them for a while, then moved the curtain out of curiosity, and a second later they were gone. I've never seen them again after this though, and I still check the street every now and then whenever I approach the window. My impression is that I somehow took a peek into some other reality where it wasn't cold, or saw ordinary two men going on their way. But who knows what it really was. I did see some other strange things during my life, but I can be fully sure of it. I'm not impressionable, and I try and find a rational explanation for everything. And this is the only case where I can't. Maybe some of you have some insight as to what this could have been. This happened about 2 years ago. I'm 16 now, and he's going to be 20 in August. We met through the internet. It turned out he lived in a city right next to my village. I was 12, he was 16, and we lost contact. 2 years later, I messaged him again, because my friends edited a photo of him and dared me to send it. He seemed nice. We had a lot of shared interests, and talking with him felt pretty natural. I was used to age differences, because for some reason I never met people my age, so I didn't mind it. He took the bus to my village a few times, and we hit it off pretty well. He even met my best friend. Then I heard he had a Skype call with one of my online friends specifically, that he told her how his last girlfriend supposedly killed herself because of him, because of the horrible things he said to her. My friend felt like he was beginning to crush on her, maybe because she was nice and all too kind. The other friend voiced her worry over him turning her into his ex. She was understandably grossed out. My friends talked with him about it and asked why he told them, but not me. He said I was too immature to understand. I was upset. I was the person who introduced him to my friend group, and he was now trying to forcefully cut me out of it. My friends had enough and cut him out instead, but I didn't. I felt really bad for him. He was an orphan who lived alone, had issues with alcoholism, and a lot of trouble with depression. Losing 3 people could have been very devastating, so I kept messaging him. Maybe out of pity, but he turned very, very creepy very fast. Suddenly, he started calling me darling. I was over the moon because I caught feelings, a little puppy crush on someone I knew I could never date, but who gave me hopes that maybe, just maybe, I could. He spent more time with me, sent me pictures and videos of him going on about his day. Nothing too unusual. Until one time, we called while I was busy playing a game on my laptop. I don't remember what I said exactly, but I remember him being very excited that 15 is legal age in Poland. I was excited too. I don't know why. I remember being very stiff, even though this was a harmless phone conversation. The joke was, until February, because I turned 15 then, and he was supposed to visit. I felt like I owed him everything, just because he had issues with his mental health. He told me that his psychiatrist said she had never met someone so young that has lived through so much. Even though our conversations weren't about depression at all, I felt very bad for him. That's why I never said anything about the things he did that creeped me out, or made me feel unsafe or uncomfortable, because I was afraid he'd feel worse and do something to himself. A number of times he told me he would end his own life, so what if I were the reason he'd tried again? He'd already told me about his issues with loneliness and abandonment. When he visited, I learned he still had feelings for his supposedly dead ex-girlfriend. He played a song that was their song. Every word in it described their relationship. While we were in my room, he was close to crying, but I had no idea what to do. He put me in this situation even though he knew I wasn't equipped to deal with it. Once, when I was so upset, I told him I didn't want to be cheered up. I just didn't. All I wanted was to be alone. So he sent me a bunch of texts, pictures and cheap cheer-ups, things he found on his phone. It was the only time I set some sort of boundary and he broke it immediately, with an "oops, sorry, too late." A little later on in the year, I had a school trip in October, and I had a good time. From what I remember, but for some reason, I lost all of my feelings for him there and then. Perhaps it was because once I didn't force myself to feel bad for him and constantly check if he's online or wanted to talk. And maybe because all my friends thought we were going to date, and it was really unnerving that they didn't see anything wrong with it. I cut contact with him later, very slowly. I deleted him off everything. He never checked. I blocked his number, blocked his Facebook, and that's when he noticed, but I never looked back. Later on, through yet another friend, the only one that still kept in contact with him, I learned that his ex wasn't dead. There were screenshots of him talking with a family member about the funeral, then screenshots of him talking about moving in with a girl 2 years older than he is, who was the love of his life, who had the same name as his ex. He sent a picture that was supposed to prove that she was in a psych ward, but even my friend refused to believe him. I don't even know what he was lying about at the end of it, or if he was lying at all. Next school year I'm going to go to the city he lives in. I know he's still out there, and I hope to not meet. This really unnerving event occurred a few weeks ago, and I have to admit, I'm still a little paranoid. As a 16-year-old girl, the 5 friends that were with me during that day are the same age and all female. We all decided to hang out at my house that day, considering we all haven't been with each other since the summer started. It was early afternoon by the time everyone had arrived. We were all having fun playing video games, chatting, and watching videos for the first few hours. A little later, as we sat through some quiet and awkward moments of boredom, one of my friends suggested we should go outside somewhere. Our first thought was to walk to a nearby grocery store, but that was immediately eliminated off the list, since it was going to be a 10 to 15 minute walk in 90-degree Fahrenheit heat. I spoke up, saying there's a small park only a few minutes away from my house. We all agreed to the idea, getting ourselves ready to head out. As I tell my mum where we're going, I lock the door behind us and start walking. We spend the last hour at the park. We're all exhausted, while at the same time not ready to leave just yet. We settled down at a picnic table and passed time chatting until one of my friends noticed a red car parked on the side of the street a little ways away from us, at the very front of the park. I didn't think anything of it at first, until she mentioned the man inside was repeatedly looking over at us. We thought it was odd, but nothing harmful. Still, we decided to leave, taking a different route home just in case. We arrived at the same street my house was on, relieved that we didn't see the same car, but anxious that it could appear again at any moment. It seemed like our suspicions were confirmed. The car then drove by us slowly, the man inside getting a closer look at us as we got a closer look at him and his vehicle. He was African American, slim, wearing a white baseball cap and muscle top, and driving a red 2003 Honda CR-V. He stopped adjacent to my house, out of all places. I was now unsure of what to do. One of my friends told me to call my parents, and I reluctantly complied. He called my dad and asked him to get us outside the house. He was slightly confused, but he agreed to do so anyway. And a few seconds later, I saw my dad on our front lawn, and we rushed over to him to tell him about the red car that was still parked near us. He ushered us inside, all while keeping an eye on the creepy man. We all sat down to take a rest, as my dad was taking pictures of the car and license plate. We were all discussing what just happened, and one of my friends apparently noticed something we did not. According to her, when the man parked his car, leaned back in his seat, he had his phone facing us through his rear window, and he was staring at us through his rear view mirror. It made me feel so sick and disgusted, wondering what that guy planned on doing with the photos and videos he took of us. We continued observing the same car that was in the same place for another 10 minutes, until my dad started pulling out of the driveway to leave for work. My dad started driving in the car's direction, and the creep booked it out of there, fearing the possible confrontation. My friends and I released a sigh of relief when we all returned to having a fun afternoon. At least now I have a picture of the car and the license plate, so I can identify it. I haven't seen the man ever since, and I hope it stays that way. This happened to me a few days ago. When it happened, it severely creeped me out. I spoke about it with my therapist, and they suggested I write it out. So my next-door neighbor, who was a nice little old lady, had made cinnamon rolls as a thank you for me shoveling her sidewalk. I was sent out to grab them. She said she kept seeing something in the window, but I saw nothing. I thought nothing of it and moved on. As I was walking up my front stairs, I could see my porch, where we have this light-up Christmas dog. I walk in front of it as normal, but as I am on the side of the porch, I look over, and its head was turned completely on its neck, staring at me. I jumped back in fright and let out a little cry. I shook my head to look at it again. It was normal looking once more, but facing the other way. I grabbed my mum, and she looked from the same angle and saw nothing. Later that night I investigated the dog, and found its head is fixed and can't turn the way I saw it. I don't know what happened, and I don't know if what my neighbor saw was related. God knows I'm terrified of that dog now. To give a bit of context, this story involves me and my two best friends, Andrew and Marion. We are 3 classmates, all 18-year-old males. At the start of the week, Andrew kept bothering me and Marion about going to a certain party outside the city, in the town where he lives. Andrew said some guy was throwing a party and had bought a lot of food, alcohol, and weed for us, and there would be no need for us to bring anything. It sounded great. Both me and Marion asked who the dude was, and Andrew said it was someone who he knew, and the situation seemed fine. Next issue would be transportation to said town, but Andrew also assured us that the guy would come and collect us in his car and then drive us back the next day. Friday rolls around, and both me and Marion had partied hard the night before, having slept something like 3 hours. The dude who came to pick us up was apparently a religion teacher in the town Andrew grew up in, and about whom he had told us a lot of shady stuff. The dude seemed to be in his mid-30s, but was apparently older. What we knew of him was that he basically did crazy stuff with a lot of young people, like parties and alcohol, but it just seemed like this guy was trying to relive his youth, so we went along with it. After all 3 of us were in the car, he said that if we got to guess his age, he'd buy us another lot of weed. After a few guesses, me and Marion failed to find out his age. Andrew, even though he knew, didn't want to tell us. It seemed like a fun game. Then the dude drove us to some place to apparently buy more weed. We ended up on the road. The trip was supposed to be a few hours drive away from the city, but this guy was insane. He sped all the way there, overtook people from the right, drove on the left lane just so that he could scream while seeing the other cars coming straight ahead. It was a hell of a ride, and both me and Marion were absolutely crapping ourselves, wondering if we were even going to make it to the party. Andrew was somehow not fazed by any of this, since he knew the guy, and apparently this was what he did. What we kept wondering was, where does the dude get money from to buy a couple of young boys alcohol and weed and food? The story seemed like a modern version of Candy in a White Van, so I, from the moment I realized it, kept an eye on the shady teacher. Marion, even though he shared his concerns at first, started thinking we got the wrong picture, and the dude was just really trying to have fun and relive his youth. During our bumpy and hellish ride, I questioned his driving skills at one point. He then proudly pulled out his wallet while driving and gave me his license to prove that he was certified to drive almost every type of vehicle. At that point, I caught a glimpse of his birthday written on the license, 1975, which meant, at the time this happened, he was 42 years old. Okay, not really weird, but why would he try to hide his age? We had finally gotten to his house, and he then gave us some pizzas he had brought earlier. I was a bit cautious since he may have put something in the food, but since he ate from the same pizza we did, I laid low. When I mentioned that I now knew he was 42, he was visibly disturbed and kept trying to argue that he does look a lot younger. None of us said he looked older, just that we knew his age. Then he showed us all the alcohol that he had bought for us. His fridge contained the following. There were around 2 or 3 dozen beers, 4 bottles of wine, a 1.5-litre bottle of Jack Daniels, and a bunch of other whiskies and bottles of spirits laying around his kitchen. This was weird, since we were there for mostly the weed and weren't planning on drinking a lot, but he was very keen on us drinking something before we smoked. The plan was that after we arrive and grab a bite to eat, he would go pick up one of our classmates and her brother, who was a bit older than us, from a nearby village. They were there visiting their grandparents, and we thought it'd be nice for them to join the party. He kept telling us to drink, and then wanted to stay for a while longer, before going to pick them up. Then he wanted to not fetch them, and kept asking, "We'll have fun on our own, why do we need a girl round here?" It was a bit weird, but after a bit of convincing he left. During this time, I was on high alert, but nothing super weird happened. Sure, the whole experience seemed a bit out of place, but heck, we're young. All three of us decided that this was either going to be a shit show and something bad will happen, or on the other hand, it could be the night of our lives. Before he left, he said he wanted to give us a tour of the house. It was an old, traditionally decorated house. This is in Romania, by the way, for context. And as we went through all the rooms, I wanted to check for creepy things or out-of-place doors. In the last room, there was this small door on the wall which I asked him about. He kindly showed me it was a small storage room with barrels of a local alcoholic drink that had about 80% alcohol. When we came back, after about half an hour, we had already drank a few beers and were in quite a good mood. He kept trying us to down glasses of Coke and whiskey, and he proposed that if Marion downed his glass, he would down one himself. After a while, I noticed that he kept saying to himself that he shouldn't have a drink or drink that much alcohol, but in an unusually angry tone. He seemed to be highly displeased at the fact that he was tipsy, and the party kept going, and then he brought the weed. There was so much of it. The three of us usually smoked joints, but we decided it was time for our first blunts. So we rolled up 2 fat blunts. We smoked them, and I went straight to the skies. During this time, I only noticed him puffing once or twice. That was a bit weird, but I brushed it off. I was having quite the enjoyable trip. He pulled his phone up and started recording us. That was weird. He wanted to record us while being high off our tits for his Snapchat account. And I thought it was strange that someone his age had Snapchat. The only question I had was why he would post on his story, since people his age or work-related contacts may see him getting high with a bunch of high schoolers, which doesn't look good. Or who would he want to send that video to? Anyway, what really started being weird was that he kept trying to force Andrew and Marion to hit the last blunt. He kept taking it and pushing it towards them. It didn't seem like a friendly gesture, but rather a command, or him forcing it on them. Andrew got up after a short while and sat in the kitchen with his head on the table. He was out. He never tried to approach me though, and I think it was because he felt I was being cautious of him and had my eye on him. For a while after the blunts, I stopped caring. But as the trip wore off, I started to notice really weird behaviors. The guy apparently also owned a gym, but he kept proposing to Andrew and Marion that they go to hit the gym at 3 in the morning, since he owns it and he's going to open it just for them. Both my friends are pretty buff and hit the gym often, so it seemed like a cool idea at first to them. I knew his gym was quite a drive from here, and I could also remember Andrew telling me that the gym was in an abandoned building, as he'd been there before. Since Andrew himself was out cold on the kitchen table, the creepy guy kept proposing that only him and Marion go. Now, that was the first time I stepped up my protective attitude and made a plan. I wasn't going to let the two of them go alone. We moved Andrew to the bed and then just sat around chatting with music in the background. One particular thing we noticed in this is that on several occasions he kept asking Marion if he had any cell signal, which he did. This is when things got super creepy. Not only did he start mildly touching Marion's shoulder, while saying he looked a lot better than Andrew. At first we thought it was just gym talk, like dudes always get from other dudes that hit the gym. The sort of, nice pegs bro. But it was creepier than that. Then he started looking at our classmate, and kept saying that he'd love to cut her beautiful hair off with a pair of scissors, and then we'd force laughs and try and change topics. He'd bring this stuff up again, and at that moment everyone in the room knew that something was really not cool. When we asked him casually about how he had so much money, he said that he usually had to fly down to London every week, but he'd only stay there for a short while, and maybe he owns prostitutes there, or little boys. He laughed. He kept telling jokes all night about how he had money, like how he was a janitor at the Houses of Parliament or some other stuff, but it seemed a bit too real, especially since his eyes had this weird glint in them when he mentioned the boys. Our classmate's big brother, who didn't drink anywhere near as much as we did, suggested that the guy drive them back home. He took a lot of convincing and now kept trying to make them stay. While all of this was going on, he kept playing jokes on Marion about how I'm gonna sleep with Andrew in bed and how they were gonna get together under the same blanket. Just a lot of creepy stuff, insinuations. Once Marion was sitting down, he grabbed his wrist and kept saying, "Yes, Marion, nice biceps." One thing Andrew told us was that he was gay, as a slight joke. The dude then played on the card of, "Oh, do you actually believe him? Andrew's just spewing crap." While we were driving there, Andrew said, "I thought you were either gay or really generous with people, and I think the conclusion that you are just really generous." Marianne actually believed this as well, and we just thought this guy was odd. The guy was offering us his house, food, alcohol, and weed, and we didn't want to think that he was into younger guys, since we tried to see him in a good light. But after the hours that went, and all the creepy things that he did and said, our minds were starting to change. It was later in the night that Marion asked, since he was so drunk on high, "Dude, are you gay or something?" Then the guy went into a weird rage. "No, stop believing the lies Andrew told you, of course not." He went into this weird state like he was half talking to himself, angrily shouting, and he also at some point grabbed Marion by the neck, joking about how he is displeased by him not wanting to come to the gym at 3 a.m. Marion is freaking the hell out. He understood now, like I had suspected all night, that this guy was not in his right mind, definitely gay, and maybe into smaller kids. And shortly after grabbing Marion and trying to convince him to go, he left to deliver our classmate and his brother. The moment he left, Marion started freaking out. He wanted to wake up Andrew so that the three of us could go to sleep in the same bed, and the dude would sleep alone, as there were 2 double beds. He tried to slap and pour water on his face, but Andrew wasn't going to wake up. I went into the kitchen, brought a knife, and gave it to Marion, and told him to keep it under his end of the bed, as he slept against the wall. And I had an empty beer bottle near my end for a quick grab. We considered calling the cops, but the creepy teacher didn't exactly do anything the police could arrest him for. It was the middle of the night, and we were on the outskirts of a town at a really long drive away from our city, with no chance of us catching a way out of there. None of us had a driving license or friends to call and pick us up at that hour, so I proposed we play it cool with the guy once he came back. If he tries anything, there were at least 2 of us, and 3 if we could wake Andrew, and there was no actual weapon in the house, not even a bat or something. Our plan was that if at any time during the night we hear the guy try anything on Andrew, we'd knock him the hell out, then tie him up with my belt, and then call the police. He came back after a short talk and we went to bed. He left the light on in the kitchen, so our room had some light. His room was right next to ours, and there was no hall or door between them, just a doorway. The bathroom was also in his room, but right next to this doorway. Both me and Mariam were freaking out. This was roughly 4 a.m, and we had to stay awake the whole night. My best friend was high as a kite, and scared. My adrenaline was pumping so hard I barely felt it, but was definitely in my system. The guy genuinely wanted to sleep, but we tried to stay awake all night. My phone was on the table next to the bed, dead but charging, so we kept writing a note file on his phone and passing it from one to another to communicate. We knew that if we even tried the slightest whisper, he'd wake or hear us. Mariam would write something, he'd pass the phone to me, Then he'd fall asleep for 30 seconds as I wrote, and then he'd wake up to write a response. We did this for a while. Then we heard the guy get up and go to the bathroom. The very second we heard movement, Mariam was clutching the knife, and I had the bottle in my hand. This happened about 4 times. It's a weird amount of times to go to the bathroom since we drank a lot, so he should be dehydrated as hell, but he's 42, and he kept drinking water every time he woke. We could hear him gulping. At 6:30 a.m., however, we somehow fell asleep. It was the most disturbing and scary sleep I ever had. Then I felt Marian jabbing me in the ribs. I felt like I was home, and I had just dreamed everything that had passed that night. I then jumped. I had both my hands on my bottle, and there was a dark figure standing at the end of the bed. Both me and Mariam froze, then realized, to relief, that it was Andrew. He told us, when he brought us to this house, that he had to leave somewhere in town around 9 a.m. next morning, so he'd probably wake up early to leave, and then to wake us when he returned. That's why me and Marian crapped our pants, thinking it was the guy, when it was actually like 7:45 in the morning. We'd fallen asleep for roughly an hour. Me and Marian had no clue how to tell Andrew what happened. The guy was still in the house. He woke up and acted supernatural, like nothing had happened. And to be fair, nothing major happened, but his behavior definitely scared the crap out of us. Who wants to grab boys, and then he tells a girl he met a couple of hours ago that he'd love to drive his scissors through her beautiful hair? That sounds like the psycho in a cheap horror movie. After the guy left around 8:30, we told Andrew everything. He was laughing at first, but then realized how creepy this was. It was really something we had no idea what to do about. We were once again stranded, our only way home being this guy or calling our parents. We thought we'd look through his house, and if we find anything really alarming, we'd call the police. Not a lot later in the search, I found a particular envelope in a cupboard filled with books. It was some sort of official document, and it had the name of a UK official border customs. It was torn open, and I pulled out a bunch of papers. After reading for a while, I found out that apparently he was caught smuggling 12,000 cigarettes out the UK. Okay, that was weird, but the next thing blew my mind. I kept noticing a small closet in the corner of the room where we were chilling, and I kept wondering all night why it was there. While he was gone off running his errands in town, I went ahead and opened it. And when I opened the closet door, I found a plastic envelope filled with random cutouts of this young guy and several other young men. Now this guy seemed to have the patience to sit with a pair of scissors and cut this guy out, put it in that envelope and tape them to the closet door. That's kind of messed up. When I showed the guys the pictures and the letters from the UK, we knew something was up. There was still nothing we could have done, and as a result, we waited for him to come home and tried to rush him into driving us home. And after a few setbacks, we finally made it. A really unsettling fact was that during our drive back, Andrew asked him for his phone, and we browsed his gallery while laughing. He had an unsettling amount of videos with Marian. I don't know what to make of all of this. The guy's most definitely insane, and does some shady stuff for money, but I honestly doubt there's anything serious to take to the police. So, creepy guy, let's not meet again. For context, I am female, and at the time of this story had just turned 15. I live in a very small and quiet village in England, where everyone knows everyone and the elderly come to retire. The village has a few shops that barely last months without closing and reopening something new. After you've pictured this village, as you can imagine, after 8 p.m. it becomes a ghost town. One night at 9 p.m, I was with my older sister Polly and her friend Lisa. They wanted to go have some drinks with my older sister Zoe, who lived 50 minutes away. Me being young, I of course begged them to let me go with them. My parents never being around meant I could do pretty much anything without issue. I was a good kid. I wouldn't be drinking alcohol. I just wanted to go out late and feel and be treated like a big kid. All three of us were roughly 5'6", so we all looked fairly young, although my sister and her friend were in their early to mid-20s. Now, while my sister went into the store to get alcohol for them, Lisa and I sat on a bench under a rather dimly lit light next to the road. Lisa was noticeably quiet and nudged me, telling me there was a man watching us. She then turned her back to him so that I could face his direction without making it obvious. There, stood about 10 meters away, was a tall, slender man wearing all black clothes and a beanie. I couldn't make out much as the only light around was the one that we were standing under, but he was bald. What's scary about that, you may ask? The man was looking into an abandoned shop window, not moving, just staring into the window with his back facing us. The type of glass on the window was frosted and blacked out. You couldn't see what was inside, but you could see reflections. The light we sat under made it perfect for him to see everything around him, including us. There is something truly sinister about someone staring into a blackened window in the middle of the night, right at you, watching. Why? I thought. I felt sick. Polly comes out the store cheery with her alcohol in a grocery bag, and we swiftly make our way towards our destination. Once a little bit away from the man, we're not looking back, and I tell Polly there's a man watching us. And as I said, Lisa whispered that, and I could hear the panic in their breath. Let me explain the area. There are two paths that are separated by a small river. You could easily jump to the other side without issue. I know this, as I used to do exactly that with my friends. The two paths met at the end, and you could either take a right and go through a shortcut, or through a large unlit field that took us straight to Zoe's house, or left, which meant you stayed on the road with houses around us, but a route that added another 15 minutes on our journey. The path that we were on is next to a lit road with houses. I turned around and saw the outline of the slender man. He was walking on the right side of the river in between the trees in the dark. My heart was in my mouth. We began to speed up, and so did he. My sister Polly, being the more outgoing type, takes out the glass bottle from the bag and grips it in her hand, ready to swing should he try anything. We stopped to check his whereabouts and took some cover behind trees which obscured our view. My heart pounding. All I could hear were the deep, heavy thumps of my heartbeat in my ears. I have a heart condition. My heart feels like it was about to beat out of my chest quite literally, and it was deafening. We moved into the middle of the road to distance ourselves from the man further. We were nearing where the two paths meet. If we took a right and went through the unlit field, we would have crossed his path, putting us in the dark alone from any civilization. We needed to make a break for it. We shouted at each other to run, and I gripped onto my sister's jacket and ran as we left following the unlit road. We ran without looking back. I could feel my throat burning with each rapid, painful breath, and when we were far away from the path, we stopped to gather ourselves and look back. He was gone. Relief washed over me as I caught my breath. We began the longer route to Zoe's, discussing the recent events. Soon enough, I felt the aching knot forming in my stomach once more, as I realized we still had to pass the side exit of the field. I mentioned this to them as we neared it, and Polly pulls me on the outside, protecting me from the field, bottle in hand. There were no sign of the man as we passed, and although it was extremely hard to see anything, just a field of inky darkness, leaving your mind to play tricks on you. Once we passed, I realized I had held my breath the entire time, and I felt like I was about to vomit from lack of air and adrenaline. I managed to regain my breath, and we were quick to make it to my sister's safe. I explained to Zoe about the man, and she shook us off and told us that we were overreacting. Classic Zoe. Nonetheless, we had a good night, but we still had to walk home, and it was filled with much fear. And I'm glad we didn't see the creep again. I still live in the same eerie village, now nearing 20 years old. I wonder what intentions this strange man had for us, who was following us in the dark. I am a college student, and this happened during my sophomore year. I'm a theater minor at a college in Wisconsin, and I auditioned for a role in a musical, which I got. The musical was cast right before winter break, and unfortunately, rehearsals start up before our break was over. We needed to come back a week early before everyone else and live on campus to make sure we could attend the nightly rehearsals. The city that my college is in is very small. It's a real college town, so during breaks it almost turns into a ghost town. Almost all the life is sucked out of it when the students go away. Our cast was also small. This was a rather intimate show with only about 8 or 9 cast members, and a lot of them were upperclassmen who had their own houses and apartments. Unfortunately, as the sophomore that I was still living in the dorms at the time. The dorms and educational buildings on my campus are all locked electronically with your student ID acting as a key, and only letting you into certain buildings. As a safety precaution, before breaks, all educational buildings are locked completely and thoroughly checked to make sure no stragglers are left behind. Since I needed a place to live during rehearsals, the university gave me ID access to the dorm I lived in. For reference, the dorm that I was in was big. It was actually 2 full dorm buildings combined into one mega dorm building. And like most buildings on campus, the lights in the hallway/common area are set on motion sensors, so the lights shut off after a set period of time and flick on when they sense motion. They do this to try and conserve energy. Rehearsals during this 1-week period were all night. I believe they started around 6 and we would get out around 11. This was during the winter in Wisconsin. So most nights I would come out of rehearsals and it would be super dark out and snowing heavily. I would make my trek across campus from the theater to my dorm. Normally this isn't an issue. It's a walk I had taken many times in the past. But remember, I was only of a handful of people on the entire campus, and the only person staying in my dorm building, which normally houses a few hundred students. So the fact that I was pretty much alone in this entire town, and I was the only person in my huge dorm building, was pretty intimidating. I would walk in the pitch black building, only to have the lights flicker on as I entered. The hallways were dead quiet. Rooms were dead quiet. I was the only person there. On top of that, I was the only person with access to the building. As a safety measure, they only gave my ID access to the building I was staying in. The first couple of days were fine. I was obviously a bit creeped out being in this place alone, but I coped and I made it work. On day 4 or 5 into the week, I can't remember which, something unexpected happened. I came back from rehearsals to the massive building and headed straight to my room. I remember sitting down on my couch and starting to watch TV. Some time passed. I'm not sure how much, but then it happened. My door handle jiggled, not a little jiggle, not something that could be explained by a gust of wind or me hearing things. When I say jiggle, I mean, the thing rattled like someone was trying to open a locked door. I remember promptly going to my peephole and looking to see if the motion-activated lights had been turned on. My first thought was maybe a security guy came to check on me, or maybe it was a fellow castmate who somehow got into the building and wanted to stop by and say hello. But no, the lights were off. No one caused any movement to turn on the lights. I'm not a drinker and I don't do drugs, so me being under the influence is not an explanation. I have never hallucinated in the past, or had any sort of experience like this before. Someone or something jiggled my door handle. To this day I have no explanation for it, and it has truly frightened me. This happened 3 summers ago. To preface this, I have been on a shocking amount of dates and put myself in many a foolish situation in the past. I'm a female and was 25 at the time it happened. It started off on the POF app. I came across a cute guy. He was my type, physically, kind of nerdy looking. On his profile, he had a very adventurous photo of him hiking and traveling. He seemed really exciting to get to know. Once he saw I looked at his profile, he sent me a message. We flirted a bit back and forth and exchanged numbers, even though he lived about an hour away. He said on the app he's never been to my city and didn't plan on it, so we probably wouldn't meet. I respected his honesty. I don't like wasting my time. One day shortly after meeting him online, he texted me randomly saying he's in my town on some work thing and invited me to a bar he was at. I decided to meet up since I was already in the area, and he said he would pick me up. I was dumb and agreed, even though it was just 4 blocks away. It took him way longer than it should have to get me, and I honestly don't think he was actually ever at the bar. Once in his car, I noticed it was a rental, and that it seemed like he had just gotten his license because he was a terrible driver. After driving in circles, he told me to pick a place, but not in the area because parking is impossible. I picked a place 15 minutes away by car with lots of parking, but also a busy place since I was not with a stranger. Once there, he started pressuring me to drink. He insisted. I'm not a huge drinker, but I enjoy pub-style bars, and I caved and had a drink and was again pressured to have another. He was very pushy and seemed really irritated that I wasn't going for it. Usually, I'd end a date pretty quickly if being mistreated, but he became charming enough to keep me there, at least until we were done with our date. I saw an old acquaintance at the bar and wanted my date to know I knew him. In my head, I think I wanted my date to know that someone could identify him. I'm not a paranoid person, but I think my subconscious was on alert. After an hour of talking in the car, I tell him I'm ready to head out. He insisted we go across the road to grab a coffee, and at the time it seemed strange to me. Neither of us had had much to drink and didn't need to sober up. Coffee seems like an odd choice otherwise. But I entertained it, and once there we sipped our drinks. He told me he had rented a beautiful Airbnb in a nearby neighborhood that is more out of the city/country, and he told me he had it all to himself and invited me, going on about how nice it is. I kept politely saying no and throwing around different excuses, which he would counter with a reason for me to come. With no intention of going, I agreed, but only if he would drive me home to get overnight things. I felt he wasn't going to let me say no, so he seemed happy with that answer and we headed out. While driving in the direction of my place, he said instead he would stop at a 7-Eleven and grab me travel-sized toiletries so I wouldn't need anything. I felt panicked because my plan was not to go with him. Something about him was off and I felt stupid for even getting back in his car to begin with. He turned his car and we were then heading towards a more country-like area. Literally, there aren't any 7-Elevens or anything in the middle of nowhere. Then I mentioned that I'm actually thinking I'd prefer not to stay with him and asked to be brought home. He then said something that made me completely nervous to be around him for any longer. He said he's sharing the Airbnb with the owners and that they are really fun and sweet and that they drink and play games together, when originally he said he had it all to himself. I knew that I didn't want to make it obvious that I was catching on to his lie, so I went along with it and said, "Oh, I have to wear my cute fluffy overnight PJs instead of my date dress because I want to be more comfy." Then I spewed on a few other things. I mentioned that I need my medication and absolutely can't miss a dose. Surprisingly, he turned around and we drove back into the city, and I felt more calm but not safe. Finally, we got close to my place. I had no intention of him getting close enough to know where I lived. He was mentioning that he was going to come up to my apartment once we got there, and that's just one huge hell no. I didn't know what I would do, but I looked for an opportunity to get out of the situation, knowing he could turn around and take me somewhere private in a matter of 15 minutes. We got to a stop sign where people were crossing, thank God. I quickly but calmly got out and said, "You know what? I have a headache. I'll text you." I closed the car door, went through a public park, which was beside a building that his car wouldn't be able to drive into. I looked back to make sure he wasn't getting out of his car/following, and I could see him staring at me. He was so furious I have chills thinking about it. Within the hour, he had blocked me on the app. Looking back, I think he possibly wanted to get me a coffee to put something in my drink. I think he told me on the app that we weren't ever gonna meet to maybe cover his ass. And I know he didn't have good intentions. Since then, I have met my fiance on the app and was super careful about dating up until then, making sure the first few dates are very public, and arranged my own transportation. I had a friend called Alicia. My town is mostly quiet. Not much happens around here, so when I'm walking around I don't feel like I'm in any danger. My town park has a section to the side which has hedges in the shape of a square, just over a meter high with some gravel. A statue and two benches facing each other about 10+ meters away from each other. So because it has a statue, it's called the Memorial Park. Most dog walkers don't go in that area because a lot of people sit there and there isn't much room to throw a ball. Not to mention, there was a huge field-size area for dog walkers and anyone else to go just behind us. Me and my friend just sat on a bench talking when this old guy with a dog trailing behind him comes into the memorial area. I must mention that me and my friend were sat in that area because I, at the time, was deathly afraid of large dogs, so I had my eye on him. The second he walked in there, he starts throwing the ball for his dog to chase. Nothing too strange yet, apart from the fact he kept staring me down, and when we made eye contact, didn't look away. My friend looked over to him, then back to me, and each time the ball is thrown it got closer and closer to me. Both the man and my friend can both see me visibly flinch and tense every time the dog runs to the ball. My friend took one last look at the man and suggested we leave. Now, there is one entrance/exit to the Memorial Park area. We didn't want to walk past him because he was stood next to the exit, so we chose to leave through the gap in the hedges in the back, which was made from so many people forcing their way through that area. The guy follows us through the gap at a distance. Seeing as it was almost time to go home, me and my friend start heading towards the town center. The guy and his dog, who was now on a lead in front of us, I clearly remember my friend taking quick looks at the guy as we walked and her saying in hurried whispers that he was staring at me. We walked through the town center and walked to the bottom of the road where me and my friend would have to part ways. We stopped to talk about what I saw out the corner of my eye, and the man's pace visibly slowed. At this point, we had been walking around 10 to 15 minutes. He walked past us slowly and looked at me in the eyes and then turned and started walking up the road. I was going to have to walk down it, and my friend insisted she would walk me home just to be safe, and because her curfew was later than mine, she was lucky in that regard and would help me out. He walked not far in front of us the whole walk to my house, his head only occasionally turning to look back at us every few minutes. Me and my friend stood on my doorstep and spoke while he walked a little further down the road. Then he turned in the direction of my house, then got out his phone and started doing something on it. I watched as my friend walked away on a different road from the man to make sure he didn't follow her. Once she was out of sight, I rushed into my house and upstairs into the bathroom. I opened the window slightly and watched the man take one last look at my house and then walk away. The scary thing is, because it was almost 3 years ago, I can't remember what his face looks like. So if I did see him again, who knows if I would recognize him. I'm just glad he hasn't come stalking my house, at least as far as I'm aware. I moved into this house when I was 10. It sat on a pretty large piece of land in southeast Ohio. About a month or so after moving in, I started to experience my first bout with the paranormal. It wasn't a very large house. The kitchen and living room were connected with one hallway that had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom at the end. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It seemed like every time I would walk from the living room to the kitchen, I would see a tall, dark man standing at the end of a hallway out of the corner of my eye. He had a cowboy hat, a long trench coat, and long hair down to his shoulders. I'd see him, and my heart would get that sinking feeling, and I would bolt out the back door. I hated it. I told my mum about it all the time, and she said I was being silly, and that I just have an overactive imagination. But it kept happening more and more often. I was really freaked out. It probably didn't help that it was right in front of my bedroom. After about a year or so, I became numb to it. Then it got worse. I started noticing things in my bedroom at night, but I would always be too afraid to get out of bed and check. The corner by the closet door would be really dark for a while, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then it would go back to normal. Sometimes it would move to parts of the ceiling. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. One night, I had this terrible nightmare that this stuffed animal that I had won at an amusement park a week or so prior was attacking me, clawing at my throat and trying to choke me. This thing sat on my dresser. When I finally woke up, the stuffed animal was on my chest. I was super freaked out. I screamed and cried all the way to my mum's room. She told me to calm down and that it was nothing, and she laid me back down. A few days later, I was forced awake by something pushing me down on my chest. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't do anything. After about 10 or 15 seconds, it stopped, and once again I leapt out of bed and ran crying to Mama, and once again she made me lie back down like it was nothing. Everything kind of died down after that. A few months go by, it's winter time, and my mum and I were sitting in the living room watching something on TV. It was about 10 p.m. It was snowing, and I catch my mum staring in the other direction towards the big bay windows. Now I see it too. It was the outline of the tall, dark man standing out the window. I immediately panic. It's him. It's the guy. She grabbed the house phone and dragged me to her room and locked the door. She called the cops, but they said they didn't see anyone, and there was fresh snow on the ground but no footprints. She was freaked out. I think she finally realized I wasn't making any of it up. We moved a month later, and to this day, some 23 years in the future, I still have his image, burnt into my mind. I am the eldest of 3 brothers, and this is some number of years ago now. I was 13 while my brothers were 11 and 9 respectively. We had been down the local park to play football and kill some time before it was time to sleep. School tomorrow. Great. This was our mindset at the time, so we greatly enjoyed burning off steam, running around and screaming at each other. It always got competitive, but in a fun, brotherly kind of way. We noticed a man in the distance, looking in our general direction, and it was still light and a public park, so we didn't think anything of it. However, we did note that it was kind of strange that he just stood there in the middle of the path. No dog, no children, no friends, nothing. My youngest brother also pointed out that he was wearing a trench coat. It was hot out, so pretty weird we thought, but we skipped over it as we found it kind of funny, as you can imagine, being young and immature, and found it in some ways amusing. You know that cliche that weirdos and creepers wear these coats. We made jokes that he was completely naked under there, and that some poor soul would eventually be exposed to this man's full nudity. We soon forgot about it and continued with our game. With the sun setting, we decided it was time to go. This was around a half hour after we'd seen the man, and to be honest, we had completely forgotten about him in our competitiveness. We look up, and he's still there. He hadn't moved an inch. This creeped us out, so we walked the long way back towards town, as he was blocking the shortcut, and none of us really wanted to pass by him. He was tall, and we aren't a particularly tall family. Even at that age, we were short, and this guy was easily over 6 foot. But it was hard to tell from where we were standing. Regardless, he was too tall to risk anything. We headed home, teasing each other the other way for letting that guy creep us out, even though he didn't really do anything, accusing each other of pissing our pants and crying. It was quite funny in truth, as brotherly teasing is at that age, especially when you're all in on the joke, or the subject at least. Once we arrived at town and continued past the shops and takeaway places, my youngest brother insists we go grab something to eat. He complains he's starving and hasn't eaten since lunch. It was the same case for all of us, so we agree and head to our local takeaway. It wasn't great, but it was cheap, and being kids we didn't have much money, so it was perfect for us. A burger and some chips for £2. I can't lie, a great deal. We order, pay up, and sit down as usual waiting for food. We start talking and messing around. We didn't even look when the door chimed to let us know somebody had come into the establishment. Why would we? I'm sitting on the far right, facing nothing in particular, while my brothers are sat facing each other. They're arguing about something, and I'm sat there bored and hungry, and I began to scan the room, when I look directly to my left and my heart drops. Who do I see sat on the table opposite ours? None other than the guy from the park. The trenchcoat guy staring at us, and I mean really staring. He's closer now, so I can see him. His eyes are wide. I mean it. It looked like his eyes were going to roll out their sockets at any given moment. His facial expressions were one that made me feel uneasy. He was looking at us like he wanted to hurt us. You might think he's just hungry or having a bad day, but there's no way he chose this particular takeaway after staring at us all that time, and there was no mistaking him. My only guess is that he must have followed us. I mean, we weren't careful. We never checked behind us. Why would we? Several seconds go past and it feels like minutes. This guy is looking at me, and he just starts to angrily grind his teeth with the same mad look on his face. Honestly, he looked insane. It's at this point I look away and quietly tell my brothers that the guy from the park has followed us here and is over there staring at us. Now my youngest brother has never been one for subtlety, and he blurts out loudly, "What, the freak from the park?" Me and my other brother look at each other, eyes wide, and then back at my youngest brother. The confused look on his face, how he didn't realize how weird this whole situation actually was. We simultaneously turn our heads and look back at the man who is now standing, eyes mad, intensely focused on my little brother. His face was bright red, and the vein in his forehead was almost bursting from his skin. We all just looked back, unsure of what to do. It was at this second that our food was ready and brought over to our table. We thanked him, and I know what you're thinking. Maybe this guy was just waiting for a meal and got annoyed when my brother referred to him as a freak. But he was already staring. But that aside, it was confirmed when the cook asked him if he was ready to take his order, and the man just shook his head. We were all starting to feel a little on edge, but figured surely the safest thing to do would be to stay inside a public place. So we started eating, and I even got a nudge from my brother. I look, and the man is now stood towering over us looking down. Without warning, he slams a handful of plastic forks from the counter onto our table. At first we try and ignore it, but he starts to breathe heavily, almost hyperventilating. Being the oldest, I feel I should say something in my sternest voice, which of course wasn't very stern at all. I told him we were fine, and thank you, and I hoped he enjoyed his meal. Kill him with kindness, I thought. Dumb idea. Without warning, he spreads all the forks frantically over the table, grabs a handful, and shoves them in his mouth and starts chewing them. I didn't have words. The noise is disgusting, and the crunching and choking. I look around to see if anyone else is seeing this, but there isn't anyone but us, and the cooks are in the back preparing the food. It's just us and this lunatic. Blood starts pouring from his mouth as he continues to churn these plastic forks, as he looks to my youngest brother and hisses. It's at this point we nope out of there and leave. We don't even take our food. Well, except my youngest brother, who I guess just wanted to leave after seeing. We didn't even take our food with us except for my youngest brother, who I guess just wanted to leave after seeing that, without even putting his plastic container down. We all quickly walk away, none of us talking. What could we say? We were speechless, but the look we gave each other was enough. Like, damn, did that really happen? Without warning, the man appeared from behind us, grabbed my youngest brother by the hand, and my blood turned to ice. I felt powerless. I felt paralyzed. He was so quiet. None of us heard him sneak up on us. We couldn't believe it. We'd looked behind us multiple times to make sure we weren't being followed. We were in shock he was there. He must have come through some side street or shortcut. Me and my brother just shot each other a panicked look, while my youngest brother struggled to set himself free. He hit him over the head with his food container, which was open, and of course did nothing. But as he pushed food into his eyes, it did give my brother and I a split second to do something, and I'll never forget it. Without thinking and without hesitation, my brother picked up a broken brick which lay in a pile next to a smashed up wall and swung it at the man's head with some force. He instantly let go but didn't fall, and we all booked it out of there. And he chased us, growling like some wild animal. He almost gained on us at one point, his long legs carrying him further with each stride. He was carrying something in his hand, but we were running, and couldn't see it, not that any of us wanted to find out. Eventually we lost him, in a somewhat busy part of town, and then finally made it home. We tried to tell our mum, but of course she didn't believe us. Mums never do. I know this story may seem tame to most, but it freaked us out, not least my youngest brother. Poor kid. He still hasn't been back to that takeaway. None of us have. So much for £2 meal deals. Never mind, a small price to pay. I'm just glad we did stop there that day and not head straight home. See, our mum doesn't trust us with a key, so she often leaves the front door unlocked until we arrive. If he had followed us there, and he had forced his way in, or even noticed this, it could have been much worse. I shudder to think. This story starts around 7 years ago, when I was a senior in high school. I joined the cross-country team my senior year and really loved the experience and the team camaraderie. The boys and girls team trained together in the A groups and B groups. The A group was all boys and me. I didn't mind this. It definitely pushed me to be a better runner, but it was difficult to try and keep up with them. Being an A group, I grew a lot closer to the guys, and they knew I had a boyfriend. One guy, Joe, was really funny, and we got along great. We'd sit next to each other on the bus to meet, and we'd text a lot, but I thought we were just friends. After cross-country ended, the boys convinced me to do indoor track, and this is where Joe got weird. In January, my relationship ended, and it was whatever. A high school relationship ending isn't the end of the world, but Joe started to act strangely towards me. He'd get really mad if I didn't text him back. I went to a house party and drank, and he sent me this long text about how he was disappointed in me, and he thought I was better than that. Our friendship started to get emotionally abusive. Joe kept on mentioning how I made him feel worthless, and he said things like, "I bet you wouldn't even care if I died." He got jealous all the time and became so controlling. I was already under school stress, so I decided to take a break from Joe. He didn't like this. Joe started spreading rumors around school that I was hooking up with guys that had girlfriends, and that I did sexually explicit things for weed. Just really awful things. Fortunately, most people didn't believe him. By the time outdoor track came around, our friendship was completely over. I was really happy because the girls and boys track teams were two separate things, and girls distance had their own coach and their own practices. So I saw Joe but never had to train and or practice with him. He stopped calling and texting me, and that was a relief too. After track season ended and I was about to graduate, Joe sent me a long apology. He said he didn't know he had feelings for me until my boyfriend and I broke up. He said that's what triggered his weird behavior, and he was sorry for ruining our friendship. I accepted his apology and went on with my life. We texted from time to time, but we absolutely were not close friends anymore. The summer after my senior year is where Joe started to make me nervous. At least once a week, at 1 or 2 in the morning, a car would drive down our street blasting its horn. It became such an issue that the whole neighborhood was on watch for the mystery horn blaster. I started getting texts from Joe some nights saying things like, "Come out." I'd reply the next morning with a question mark, and he'd say he was drunk and just drunk texted. I worked over the summer, so I was usually in bed by 9 or 10. But one night I was up a little late. When I turned on my light in my room, I immediately got a text from Joe that said, "Good night, Monty." It freaked me out. I told my parents everything that had happened, and they were concerned. My dad immediately thought Joe was the mystery honker. I sent Joe a non-threatening text just saying that I worked long days, so I'm normally in bed early, so I'd appreciate not getting texted so late. I still got sporadic texts from Joe, but the mystery honking stopped, which was great. In the fall, I went away to college. One weekend I came back home. I was up in my room and got a message from Joe around midnight saying, "Welcome home, Monty." I freaked out and looked outside but didn't see his car. I asked how he knew I was home, and he said lots of people were home for the weekend, so he just assumed I was too. Joe then proceeded to favorite all of my tweets, around 2,000, and like all of my Instagram posts. I had literally had enough of him at this point, and blocked him everywhere. I texted all my friends and told them what happened, and to not mention me to Joe at all, because he was definitely obsessed with me. Joe then called me and told me he was going to end himself. I told my parents everything, and my dad got the police involved, and I didn't hear from Joe after this, until 2 summers later. It's important to note around this time, one of my brothers moved out. My mum wanted to turn my room into an office, so I moved upstairs into his old bedroom. My room now faced the back part of the house, and not the street. My dad works in the courts, and occasionally he has to do bail duty, where if someone gets arrested, he's the person that has to post bail. It sucks because he can get a call at 2 a.m. and has to go to bail someone out. On one particular night, my dad got a bail call at 2. He went downstairs, got some water, and saw the motion light in the backyard was on. That was weird. He looked out the kitchen window and saw a guy in our backyard looking up at my room. He ran outside and the guy jumped the fence. The police came and took statements, but it was the middle of the night and my dad was pretty tired, so it could have been Joe, but the police couldn't really prove it. The next few months I felt on edge. I felt really unsafe in my own home. How did Joe know I moved rooms? How long had he been watching me? It was nauseating. My parents saw the toll this was taking on me physically and emotionally. I was snapping at them over small things. My hair was falling out and I was losing weight. One day at breakfast, my dad walked into the kitchen and said, "I'm handling the Joe situation today. He won't bother you anymore." After that, the incident stopped. I ran into Joe at a party a few years later. He saw me, turned white, and left the party. I have absolutely no clue what my dad did, but he made sure Joe and I will never meet again. My cousin recently reminded me of a memory I suppressed, because it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood. I'm from Texas, so we hardly ever get snow days. So when we did, I tried to take advantage of this. When I was in 6th grade, my school was shut down for 2 snow days. This never happened, and it was a miracle. On one of the days, my cousin came over, and we decided to walk to my old elementary school and go play in the park. It was about 4 blocks away from my house. I lived in that neighborhood for years, so I knew someone on almost every block. I always felt safe, and I knew the neighborhood, so walking to the park with my cousin was no big deal. We got to the park, and surprisingly we were the only 2 people there. We were having a blast. We moved from the playground to the field behind it. To kind of explain the layout, we entered the playground from the back parking lot. So we had to walk through the parking lot or the field next to it to get to the playground. There was a dumpster in the parking lot that was against a brick wall. There was a space between the wall and the dumpster that a lot of teenagers used to hang out behind. On the other side of the wall was the playground, and a few yards to the left of the dumpster was a large field. We're enjoying our time when this truck pulled up. There were 2 men inside, and I got a really bad feeling. I told my cousin that we should probably head home. My cousin insisted it was nothing, so I shook it off and kept playing in the snow. The men got out of the truck and went behind the dumpster. My cousin reassured me it wasn't a big deal, because like I said, a lot of people went back there. That's when they started yelling, saying things like, "Ooh, this is gonna be fun." Even at age 11, I was paranoid. "Come on, let's go home. They're not even talking to us, just ignore them," she said. She was in 7th grade, so I listened to her. That's until we heard the scream. "What are you girls doing here all alone? Where are your parents? You're here all by yourselves?" Chills ran down my spine. I was so scared. My cousin and I looked at each other and automatically started walking really fast through the field to head home. The men came out from behind the dumpster and started yelling, "Where are you girls going? We just wanted to talk to you." We were terrified. Our fast walk turned into a sprint. We got to the sidewalk, and that's when we heard the truck door slam. My heart sank, and I started crying. They peeled out the parking lot. All I could do was think about that we were nearly getting taken. The truck was making its way towards us. Knowing someone on almost every block ended up saving mine and my cousin's life. I had a friend that lived across the street from the school. All we had to do was cut across this small neighborhood intersection and we would be there. The truck caught up to us as soon as we crossed the intersection. They slowed down and the man on the passenger side rolled his window down. "Why are you girls running? We just wanted to have some fun with ye." The truck came to a stop, but we had made it. We ran up to the front door and started yelling for help and ringing the doorbell. The truck then sped off. We were safe. We told my friend and her parents what happened, and my mum came and picked us up. We were so scared, we couldn't even remember any details about the truck or the men. All I know is I would never go to the park alone again. If I didn't think to run to my friend's house, I don't know where I would be. If the men had caught up to us before crossing the intersection, I don't want to imagine what would have happened. I don't know what the 2 men were planning on doing to us, but I know it wasn't good. So to the 2 men that ruined my snow day and scared me witless, let's not meet. Around 9:30 p.m., mid-August 2018, somebody came to our home and rang the doorbell. I ignored it at first, because I try not to answer for solicitors, but this person knocked on the door, so I got up to see who it was. I was hesitant to answer the door, but at the time of this incident, our parents were having their basement finished, and the workers were obnoxiously notorious for working until 9 to 10 p.m. or leaving their tools in the basement and then showing up late in the day to retrieve them. So it wasn't completely abnormal to have people show up around this time of day. Upon answering the door, a man was standing there, seeming somewhat standoffish, which threw me off. He wasn't particularly big or scary. Skinny, 5'7"-ish, wearing jacket/jeans and a baseball cap. but he didn't look like any of the basement workers I had seen entering or exiting the house during this time period. He then said hello and proceeded to ask me if I knew a Manny O'Brien. I responded that I did not know anyone by that name, and they did not live here. But he repeated the question again, and I insisted I still did not know anyone by those names. "Do you know the names of your neighbors?" he asked, and pointed to the house just east of ours. This really stood out to me as suspicious for a few reasons. I work in the field of domestic violence, so creepy stalker behaviors are something I'm constantly analyzing, which is what my initial reaction was given to the weird interaction. Secondly, even if he was legit, who comes looking for their buddies at 9:30 p.m. on a weekday without even knowing where they live? After a second, I said I didn't know the neighbors well, but the house he pointed at was owned by someone not named Manny O'Brien. He then asked about the neighbor west of us, and I said that I was unsure about any of their names. He then asked if I was sure I didn't know anyone that worked for the company he said. And then he proceeded to say that he met a Manny O'Brien on Halloween of 2017 when he was taking his daughter trick-or-treating, and he wanted to connect with him again. That statement wasn't sitting right with me, as this felt all sorts of deja vu-esque, but I said I couldn't help him, and to maybe ask the neighbors since no one by that name lived here. He thanked me and walked away. After he left, I went and sat at the kitchen table and just kind of pondered about the dude at the door and why it wasn't sitting right with me. After a few minutes of thinking, it clicked in my head that someone approaching our house and asking, "Do you know the names of your neighbors?" had actually occurred on Halloween night of 2017. Flashback. I was trading off answering the door with my mother and my younger sister Kate. In the middle of trick-or-treat knocks was a man who approached our home, knocked on our door, and asked if I knew the names of the neighbors, and was trying to get basic information out of them. I found this odd at the time because Kate and I had answered the door and were tripped by the fact that this random man was inquiring about the names of the neighbors on Halloween. He also approached the door by himself, so we found it even weirder that this person we had never seen before actually approached our front door alone on a night that adults are usually with their children. I rationally can't 100% confirm that it was the same man, as I don't have any photo evidence, but I would say that I'm 90% sure it was him, based primarily on the exact phrasing and repetition of, "Do you know the names of your neighbors?" Still sitting at the kitchen table, Kate and her boyfriend exit their room and go out the porch for a cigarette. Pretty soon after that, my other sister Jamie exits her room and starts making casual small talk with me. She makes a comment about me looking confused, and I said, "The weirdest thing just happened," and explained the random guy approaching the door and how I'm confident this happened on Halloween. At this point, she is just as shaken as I am, and finds the whole thing rather sketchy. After a few more minutes of talking about it, she goes outside to join Katie for a smoke, and about a minute or two after she went outside, she sends me a text that Kate not only remembers that Halloween incident, but that Kate is also confident she had interacted with someone like this in between Halloween 2017 and August 2018. So I go outside and speak with them to get more details about Kate's encounter. The second incident between my personal two interactions happened sometime when Kate and her boyfriend were home at the time, between noon and 3 p.m. in June. A man approached them asking who our neighbors were and then left. Kate believes it could very well have been the same person when I started describing his appearance. If this story was true, This meant some random dude had approached our house at least 3 times. She also noted that just a few minutes before they went out to smoke, they noticed a dark van parked in our driveway when they were looking out their window, and that was not there when they went outside. Based on their timelines, the van would have been in our driveway when I answered the door. I didn't see it though, as the west wall of our front door blocks the view of most of the driveway, so I can't say with certainty that it belonged to the guy at the door. We go inside the house, and now all of us are on the edge, trying to figure out what to do about this creepy dude showing up at random times, asking about our neighbors and all that. As I said earlier, my initial thought was that this dude was trying to stalk someone in the neighborhood, so we started chatting about that. All of us seemed alarmed about how fake a name of Manny O'Brien sounded, so we kept going on about how there was no way that was a real person on our street. Even if this random guy had been telling the truth, why would he meet someone on Halloween night and then decide 10 months later at 9:30 in the evening that it was the perfect time to have a second friend date? On top of that, the guy came to our house on Halloween night, asking about the names of our neighbors, as if he was looking for someone, not as if he randomly ran into someone and made a new acquaintance. It makes no sense. My sisters then threw out the idea that someone was maybe trying to case our house to burglarize it, since he kept showing up at random times of the day, which stressed us all out. Our parents were expected to be out of the country in a few days for several weeks for their anniversary, and there's no way in hell that we wanted to be responsible for the house being burglarized while they were away. We then started trying to decide if this was something worth calling the cops over. As we were talking, our mum messaged us and asked why we were being so loud in the kitchen area. I told her the weirdest thing had just happened and asked if she remembered the guy on Halloween that was asking about our neighbors. She vaguely remembered, so I told her I'd explain in the morning. The next morning, I messaged my mum and explained why we were being so hyped in the kitchen. When I mentioned the idea of someone possibly casing the house, she was rightfully stressed and freaked out, noting that she was bothered about all these incidents. I figured that it would probably be the best call and call the cops, or at least report it. But unfortunately not much came from the cops. The detective I spoke to was nice and said that incidents like this happened a few years back in our neighborhood, but nothing major ever came of them, so we shouldn't be too alarmed. She actually threw out the idea that maybe the guy had gotten a fake address, in a way similar to a woman at a bar giving a fake phone number to a guy. But that seemed a little too far-fetched for me. Like, who gives out a fake address to someone, and then that person proceeds to show up multiple times to the same house, asking the same repetitive questions over the course of a year or so? That doesn't seem reasonable. The officer did agree to do some drive-bys for a few days to see if there was any suspicious activity, but I never heard back about anything. On top of calling the cops, I also decided to get the next door app and post about this incident, so other community members could be aware and keep watch. None of the neighbors had experienced anything like it, but they were appreciative of the post and suggested getting camera systems on the doors. As of now, none of us have had any other interactions with this weirdo dude approaching our house, and we hope to keep it that way. My parents have refused to put up cameras in their front yard because they don't always help with police investigations, and they're expensive. I was able to convince them to put serious locks on all the windows, but that only offers a little security to the situation. We also alerted at least one of our neighbors about the incident so they could look for any suspicious people wandering around the houses. I'm very curious if there actually is a Manny O'Brien living in the neighborhood, but not curious enough to hunt him down. I'm from Texas. I don't have many shoes with treading on them. The ones I had gotten were too worn and eventually tore, and I needed to buy some new ones. For context, I'm a chubby 5'4" girl. This was 8 o'clock at night, and this also happened on a very popular and busy street. I live in Chicago for school, and I needed to get some things before the polar vortex. The school I go to is near State Street, and I decided to go to Walgreens that was near the Chicago Theater. I had to stop by Target and then at that Walgreens. As I purchased everything and made sure I had packed in everything, I headed out to the doors. As I walked towards the exit, I noticed a small man was heading in the same direction at the same time, so I let him go first, but he just stood there staring at me. He didn't make any gestures, but I still thought, oh, maybe he wants to be nice and be a gentleman. So I went ahead first and he followed. I noticed that it had started slushing, and I knew I was going to start sliding everywhere because the boots I had on had very thin treading on it. So I had to slow down on my walk or I'd fall on my butt. I started walking, and it was at this point that I noticed him walking at the same pace as me. I thought I was in his way, but I also thought that the sidewalk is extremely big and he could easily walk around me. I still stepped to the side and see if he would go around me or something, but his shadow followed right behind me. I tried walking a little faster, but I could already feel myself slipping and losing balance. He ended up walking a little faster to catch me up, and as soon as he was right next to me matching my walking pace, I asked if he needed anything, but he didn't say a word. When I was in front of the theater, he ended up going in front of me and just stopped me in my tracks. I tried to go to the left of him, but steps in front of me to cut off my path. I tried to go right. He did the same thing. I paced a little faster, and he ended up just circling around me. He ends up blocking my path again, and gets a cigarette, and just gets right up in my face, and tried to light it up, but couldn't because of the slush and wind. I took that chance to slide away from him, but he kept trying to cut in front of me while lighting the cigarette. I made it to the CTA stop to go downstairs, but because he was super tall, he used his massive body to block the stairs in front of me. He was staring me down, and I wasn't sure what to do at that point. To my luck though, an older woman was coming through, and he let her through. I dashed through the small opening he made for her, and asked if I could stick with her because of the situation. She was super understanding, and said of course. I wanted to tell CTA personnel, but of course there was no one in the booth. We took out our cards at the same time and went through the turnstiles, and he saw that I partnered with her, and tried to dash to us, but he either ran out of money or something, because he didn't go through till a few minutes later. My new friend and I started to make small talk to calm me down a little, and asked what train I was going and where my stop was. To my surprise, we were heading to the same destination. He followed us down, still smoking his cig, but that's when CTA noticed him and began approaching him, at which point he turned around so that he could smoke his cigarette fast, so that he would be looking away from us. Our train arrived, we both got on, and he saw us and tried to get on too, but missed it by a few seconds. We both saw that it was a close call. We continued chatting even after we got off our stop, and to our surprise, she basically dropped me off home, as she only lives a block further up from me. So to the weirdo who tried following me and stopping me from reaching my destination, you creep, let's not meet again. This happened about a year ago. My church runs a college group on a plot of land that's mostly wooded, with a small clearing and pavilion set up in the middle. It's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. So I show up one night and there's a new kid called Joe. I notice right away that there's something creepy about him. We're playing a card game, sitting around a table, and he keeps saying weird stuff like, "You guys should have an upside down American flag here." A mosquito bites someone and they kill it, leaving blood on their leg, and he becomes infatuated with the blood. He calls people over from the bonfire to look at it. "Hey, look guys, blood!" He kept saying it over and over. Later we're singing a worship song and he wanders from his chair and stands on stage just watching us. I have anxiety, and at this point I'm nearly in full-blown panic attack mode, thinking any moment he's going to start shooting or something. I frantically look around and someone jumps to take him off the stage. They talk for a moment and he returns to his seat. I nope out as soon as the song is over, thinking that I'll never have to see this kid again. Wrong. He comes to my church again on Sunday morning and finds me in the crowd, starts small talking and asks me where I go to school, where I work, what's my major. I lie my ass off. He shows me pictures of his family on his phone, and I see pictures of swastikas, upside down American flags and the like. He sits next to me throughout the service, and I run to my car as soon as it's over, get in, close the door, and he stands at my window. "Sorry, I have to run, I have a family thing," I say. "I was hoping I could get your number," he says. I give it to him because I can just block him later, but I have to get the hell out of here. He calls me on the spot to make sure I didn't give him a fake, and I peel out of the parking lot losing my mind. He immediately starts texting me, asking me more questions which I ignore for the most part. I can only guess this made him angry, which would be why he sent me the following message a few days later. "That baiting is better. Gonna unleash my hell on him next time. Get to devour the whole buffet. Too bad I'm a murderer. And the fact that I'm an Irish Catholic. Next time I'm gonna show my God. I hope everyone cries at the end. Sorry, I have a temper." I finally decide to call the police and give them some info. They do a wellness check, tell me he's supposed to be taking medication and going to therapy, but he's not right now, and they advise me to block him, which I do. They say if I ever see him again, to call 911 immediately. So to the extremely odd, blood-obsessed Nazi murderer, let's not meet again. My siblings and I went on a ghost tour in Naperville, Illinois, from 8 to 10 p.m., November 1st, 2019. It is drizzling and around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. There's leftover snow on the ground from the 3 inches we got the day before. This was my first tour where EMF detectors got provided for us. The detectors were the Ghost Meter brand, and these detectors beep and flash, and I had my detector on full volume the whole time. We got some beeps and blips throughout the tour, but nothing interesting, until we arrived at the exact spot of the 1964 Naperville train disaster. The disaster left 45 dead, when an 85-mile-an-hour train rear-ended a stationary one. We were walking up the street where the public lined up the corpses and put body parts like puzzles together. All at once, everyone's detectors started to go off when we are halfway down the block. Our guide comes up to me and the conversation is as follows. "If someone is here, can you make this beep slower?" My detector's beep slowed down. I say, "Can you make it stop?" It stops. Everyone's detectors were still going but mine. The detector still read a 2. The guide asks, "Were you a World War II soldier?" The beep starts up again. Then I ask, "Would you be surprised to know the year is 2019? The beeping abruptly stops. Then I ask, "Were you on the train?" The beeping starts again. "We're sorry you died." The guide then says, "You can go now. Head to the light." And all the detectors stop and the readings go down to 0. We all sat there in shock for a good 15 seconds. We might have just helped a spirit move on. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but never have been a full believer in ghosts. Being there and having this happen to me on my EMF has definitely made me think differently now. About 12 years ago, when I was 22, I worked at a video store. It was a few days before Halloween, and my manager asked me if I could work since everyone else wanted off. Me being the good employee I am, I said yes, and asked if I could dress up. She agreed and said that I could dress up as whatever I wanted. Can I dress up as a chick? I was just joking actually, until she told me that I didn't have the hair on my nuts to. Challenge accepted. I went out shopping and bought a wig, dress, and some makeup, and borrowed a bra from my current crazy girlfriend at the time. I did makeup the way I saw my girlfriend do it, and proceeded to walk to work. Now I only live about a half mile from the store, and since I lived within walking distance to everything, I didn't see the need to have a car at the time. I started walking. I had to cross the bridge, walk across a street, and cut through an abandoned parking lot, and through an alley, and then I was there. It was dark out, but I've never had anyone bother me while I was out for a nightly walk until today. Halfway across the bridge, I look up and see a man in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, walking towards me. As I get a little closer, I realize this guy's checking me out. I giggle a little bit and laugh at the thought that I must be a pretty hot chick. I walk past him and continue on my way. And as I walk, I continue to let my mind wander in La La Land. I get through the parking lot and start down the alley when I hear someone say, "Hey, sexy girl," and I feel my ass get slapped. Not like a love tap, a full-blown painful ass slap. The kind that leaves red marks. "What?" I yell as I turn around to confront this guy and realize it was a punk, the same one I passed on the bridge. "Oh, man, sorry." He was obviously caught off guard. Looking back on it now, I can't stop laughing as I say this. But at the time I was beyond livid. I grabbed him by the cuff of his shirt and shoved him to the ground and moved to kick him a few times, but he was pretty quick to get on his feet and run away. He took off the way we came, repeatedly yelling, "Shit, shit, shit." I stood there stunned for another minute, thinking to myself, what in the hell just happened? I went into work, and as soon as my manager saw me, she started laughing. "I didn't think you were actually going to do it." Of course, she laughed even harder when I told her what you've just heard, how I was almost sexually assaulted. So pervy dude, for your sake, let's not meet. I was on my dirt bike riding along some railroad tracks when I came across a tunnel and thought, hey, that looks like a good picture. I pulled out my phone and took some images. When I was done, I looked down the tunnel and I could see the other side, and thought I saw what appeared to be a little girl in a white dress walking towards me. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I waited a second, and that's when I heard a voice directly in my left ear whisper, "They hurt me." Let's just say I didn't know that dirt bikes would go that fast after that.